including cyberbullying and the design of educational tools about the digital environment that can be used across varying contexts of learning and teaching. I would like to welcome her. Thanks for accepting our invitation. Her title of presentation is AI in Education and Ethics. So the floor is yours, Alexa. Thanks again.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Leila and BD, for the kind introduction. And it's really an honor to be part of this incredible panel of leading scholars in the field. I'm happy to now share my slides. Okay. Wonderful. So as BD mentioned, I'm a research associate on the Youth and Media team at the Berkman Klein Center. And our team includes a number of research, educational, and outreach initiatives around young people ages 12 to 18 and the digital world. And part of our efforts focus on artificial intelligence. And I'm delighted to share some of my insights today around AI, education, and ethics based on our team's work. So first, when we think about AI in the context of education and young people, this raises the question, what skills are important for young people in terms of learning about artificial intelligence? To better understand this question, several years ago, our team embarked on a journey to explore, in addition to AI, what are the skills that young people need to meaningfully engage online? And as we were asking this question, we noticed that a number of policymakers from around the world were developing or passing legislation telling schools what to teach around the digital landscape. And they often framed these efforts around the concept of digital citizenship. And we wanted to better understand what exactly are these entities referring to by digital citizenship? What are the skills that this concept encompasses? So to further explore these lines of inquiry, we engaged in a mapping of 35 frameworks from around the world on digital citizenship and related concepts such as digital competence and 21st century skills, developed by a number of entities, from academics to international organizations like the European Commission, to understand what these groups believe that skills youth need to thrive. And you can learn more about the mapping process in our team's report, Youth and Digital Citizenship Plus. And based on this mapping, our research in the field and consultations with youth themselves, as well as experts, we derived these 17 areas of life connected to the digital world that we believe are important for young people to thrive academically, socially, politically, and economically in our society. And you'll see here that artificial intelligence is one of these 17 areas, along with related areas such as data and computational thinking, and a whole breadth of areas spanning from protecting one's privacy online to exploring one's identity in the digital world. Now, what exactly do we mean by artificial intelligence as an area? From our perspective, it's important to teach youth not only the basics of artificial intelligence, such as what is an algorithm, or why is data so important in AI and machine learning, but also the ethical questions connected to these technologies. For instance, how can we reconcile our aim of collecting data with protecting the information of young users? Or what might be some of the gender biases built into AI systems? And you can learn more about some of these ethical questions in the context of AI and youth, including within the domain of education, in our team's paper, Youth and Artificial Intelligence, Where We Stand, which takes a look at what we know and what we don't know in terms of AI and youth and various domains, such as education, health and well-being, and privacy and safety. Given this vantage point, how we might think about skills associated with AI, how should we then teach young people about artificial intelligence in meaningful and accessible ways? If a young person were to Google artificial intelligence to learn more about it and clicked on images, some of the pictures and accompanying websites on this screen might appear, which may often not be quite relatable to youth and may be a bit abstract. So our youth and media team is working to make AI more accessible to young people through, for instance, developing engaging and creative visuals to illustrate different concepts connected to AI. As just one example, we're developing a children's book on artificial intelligence for those ages 5 and up that seeks to foster discussion around key themes related to AI, such as AI systems' need for representative data, or how AI can be used for social good, in this case, environmental conservation, as well as the importance of greater gender representation in the AI field, which I will return to later in my presentation. We've also developed educational activities on artificial intelligence. Our educational resource repository, the Digital Citizenship Plus resource platform, is home to over 100 open access educational tools, such as learning activities, podcasts, and visualizations that can be used to learn and teach about young people's digitally connected lives. And as I mentioned, a subset of these tools address artificial intelligence. For example, some of the AI basics, what is an algorithm? Or looking at AI in different contexts, such as social media. For instance, helping learners understand how algorithms shape the content that they see on these platforms. And all of these resources have been co-developed with young people themselves to really ensure that the materials resonate with youth's interests, experiences, and backgrounds. And incorporating the youth voice is a guiding principle of our team. We involve youth in every aspect of the research process, from conceptualizing the areas we focus on, including artificial intelligence, and as well as co-creating educational content and documenting and visualizing our work. Now that we've talked a little bit about the possible ways to teach young people about AI in a manner that's relevant and engaging to them, this brings up the question, how can we reach those youth who are particularly underrepresented in the field of AI? For example, how can we encourage youth from underrepresented populations to explore and pursue careers in the field of artificial intelligence? We know that greater representation in the AI field is needed in terms of, for instance, race, ethnicity, gender, and socioeconomic status, to name a few factors. And for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to focus on gender. For our team's report on youth and digital skills that I mentioned earlier, we feature a case study on the gender gap in computer science, which looks at the computer science gender landscape, both in and outside of the US, some of the driving social and cultural forces that have helped to shape this imbalance in the field, and different formal and informal initiatives from around the world that are hoping to make computer science a more equitable field in terms of gender. So what do we know in terms of the gender gap in computer science? Over a 12-year span, from 2000 to 2012, the number of women graduating in computer science with a bachelor's degree has decreased in many countries, particularly in high-income countries, such as the US, New Zealand, and Australia. In the US, for instance, only about 18% of women graduate with a degree in computer science. However, there are exceptions. In Turkey, for instance, the proportion of women receiving a bachelor's degree in computer science has increased from a relatively high 29% to 33% in this 12-year span. And although on a global level, the percentage of women obtaining computer science degrees and entering the field is relatively low, when one looks to certain regions of the world, there is a more diversified landscape. As just one example, in Malaysia, there's the percentage of women obtaining education and securing jobs in software and computer science departments is about equivalent to that of men, for a number of factors that we elaborate upon in our report on young people and digital skills. And there are also a set of social and cultural forces that have helped to drive the computer science gender gap. As just one example, in the US, this gap is partly due to the rise of personal computers in the 1980s. In 1981, IBM released the personal computer, and Apple launched the Macintosh in 1984. And prior to this, a few people's homes or businesses had computers, and girls and boys generally had the same level of exposure to computers, which was essentially no exposure. But as computers entered the home, they were often adopted by boys as a toy. And so by the time that young men arrived at university, they were already exposed to computers and computer programming, while women were often starting from scratch. So, given the gender imbalance in the field, what are actionable steps we can take to bring more women and girls into the field of computer science? Our case study on formal and informal initiatives around the world that are helping to bridge this gap revealed several key factors. First, making the field of computer science more accessible to those with varying levels of background knowledge in this domain. So to take one example, Harvey Mudd College, which is a science and engineering school in Southern California, has divided computer science introductory classes into two sections. One for those with no computer science experience, and one for those with a background in this domain. And the president of Harvey Mudd, Maria Claw, describes it as having these two sections helps remove the intimidation that comes from being in a class where you've had no computer science experience and someone else has been programming since they were 8 years old. Second, it's important to create engaging opportunities that help learners apply their understanding of computer science to societal issues affecting their communities. One great example of this can be seen through the program Indian Girls Code, which offers free coding and robotics education to young girls in India through after-school programs, summer camps, and the like. And the program focuses on helping young girls work together to apply their understanding of computer science to issues that are impacting their communities. So one young group of girls, for example, created an AI-based animation that aims to show the harmful impact of pollution in their village. And finally, it's important to cultivate strong mentorship networks. A good example of this is the mentorship and educational program Tech Needs Girls, which is based in Ghana. And it provides coding lessons to young girls, particularly those from under-resourced communities. And these young girls are taught by 200 female engineers and computer scientists who act as both role models and mentors while also helping to cultivate these young girls' coding skills. And another great example is, again, Harvey Mudd College, which helps to connect females to the broader computer science community. So for instance, each year, the school sends a group of students to the Grace Hopper celebration of women in computing, which is the largest conference for women in technology. So these are just a few concrete, actionable items that educational initiatives can take to increase the gender representation in the computer science field, and looking ahead, create a more inclusive future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alexa. It was a very good presentation and glimpse of what's keeping going in terms of education part. And we can make a conclusion that we also need AI literacy aside from digital literacy. So thank you so much for providing your research and sharing your experience so far.
Thank you so much.
Leyla Hocam.
Thank you, Bedicim. Now we have Emre Bayanlıoğlu, and Emre is very close friend of us. Before joining Global Center for IT and IP law between the years 2015 and 2020. Emre worked as a researcher at the Tilburg Institute for Law, Technology and Society, Netherlands. In 2004, he took part in the foundation of the Istanbul BİLGİ University Information Technology Research Center. Then he worked at the Koç University, and since 2017, he is also an external fellow of the research group on law, science, technology, and society at Vrije University, Brussels. His current research focuses on the transparency and contestability of automated decisions and the possible IP-based legal impediments at the level of implementation. And Emre, welcome again. And you have a very interesting title of your presentation. It is Data Anthropocene, the Ends of Law. We are very curious about to hear more details on that topic.
Well, I'm not sure whether I will meet the expectations, but this is to start with while sharing my screen. Well, this is not a paper or we could say a well-structured research that I have prepared. To be honest, this is more like today a little bit. This is a Friday evening musings that I could be doing in a cafe in Cihangir or a bar in Istanbul on a Friday evening. Actually, what I'm going to talk about is some concepts, points of view, perspectives, kind of thinking tools which help me to shape my understanding and especially which helped me to develop, we could say, an overarching approach or a macro view of the discipline law, IT law or IP law, and how this could be situated in the bigger picture. So in a quite a bit loose conception, I'm going to talk about certain concepts which I find of significance both for AI discussions and also for discussions about environmental law, ecological depletion, climate change, and the doomsday. So I try to show a little bit of a common, let's say, critical perspective. But as I said, this is no grand narrative, no big insights, but this is just, as I said, just to share you certain thoughts that I find helpful. So to start from the beginning, I just want to repeat this, this preface from the famous book of Ludwig Wittgenstein, the Tractatus as the short name. And this was something written in the battle trenches of the First World War, some of you might know. And as Wittgenstein says, well, the value is this in this work is thoughts are expressed, and the value will be greater the better thoughts are expressed. But he admits that, as I have to do, he can't do it well enough because his powers are insufficient. So he just wishes may others come and do it better. So I hope those thoughts would inspire more capable, much better learned, focused, and younger people to engage on those questions. To start with, what is Anthropocene? Okay, we are all, most of us are familiar with this concept. It just refers to a geologic time that the natural landscape, the earth, is shaped by humans. What makes this concept important for us is that this also tells that our civilization is no longer nested in a natural environment, the natural habitat of the world, but it's rather the habitat, the nature, the environment itself. So this seems like a significant change to understand what technology is doing. So to understand what Anthropocene could tell us about the environmental, ecological collapse, a very useful concept, a thought experiment, a concept, a term that I find very useful, entropy. It's a very complex and, let's say, multifaceted physical concept, but we just want to point out here, okay, there is this tendency that things tend to fall apart and perish. And this is the second law of thermodynamics in physics, that isolated systems tend to generate into a more disordered state. Okay, as we know, if you open the window, the room would get colder, which means that the temperature outside and inside will equal. What are we trying to actually explain with this? Isn't this common sense? Sure, but actually this is a key concept to understand or to develop a macro view, because if you think about entropy, then we come with this question. Okay, but hang on. How could this an infant baby could thrive, grow up, and get better and better instead of falling apart and perishing? This seems completely against entropy. Well, yes and no, because as you see, our world, the planet, is not an isolated system. So there is energy feedback from the sun. So at the entropic level, if you want to see the environmental problem from an entropic and systemic perspective, okay, then this is a in the broader scale an energy problem, and the source of all energy is the sun. And of course, the energy of suns comes from the cosmic Big Bang, and at the end, the universe will go to a 0 degree and will perish as well. But for the time being, due to the energy feedback from the sun, we living things are kind of exceptions or delayed entropic processes. At the end, we all know that this baby will only grow up, unfortunately, until they're around the age of 20, 25, and then entropy will kick in. Okay, so what does this tell us about? Why is this important? This is important because the entropy principle, looking at things at this scale, tells us that, okay, there are physical limits to this world we are living in. Okay, we're just sitting at a table, we are lawyers, we're policy people, we are whatever, and we make up solutions. However, we often tend to forget that whatever solutions we offer, these will have to hit the physical limits. More importantly from here, is there a limit to growth? A very early question, because this is very important in our perception of technology and following the maybe law on technology, because we are mostly going on the presumption that we can have economic expansion or material expansion maybe forever. Is this the case? Well, that's a book that I find extremely helpful, and it was kind of very enlightening for me, The Entropy of Capitalism. So the author basically engaged with the question, can all societies develop capitalistically? Well, the answer is, I think, obvious, especially after 7 years that book has been published. And in connection with this, can our current system can be transformed into a sustainable green one, or can we have responsible AI? Okay, let me add one more. So how does this relate to AI and technology? And I think we can also use at some point AI and technology in interchangeable ways, because I think AI will be a kind of an integral embedded component of any artifact in the near future. So another concept that I find helpful, ephemeralization, something again of very much common sense. If you look around, all technology or civilization is a process of doing more and more with less. We are always running to a further level of efficiency. So we want to produce more with less, but can we? So ephemeralization is a process of progression from material to abstract. So the best example that you don't have materials books anymore, but only book as a service, maybe a digital one. So everything is becoming service, because we see this ephemeralization, the concept also brings in or aligns with, let's say, dematerialization of the economy, everything turning into a service, becoming dematerialized. And this is accompanied with further financialization. The point is that this concept of financialization, ephemeralization, most of now are reinforced with AI technologies or becoming the AI itself. Anyway, is also a pressure on the environment. So it is how it connects with the environmental, ecological depletion. Because through financialization, very simply, in very basic terms, economists never tell those things in such way, but very basically, as we make our economy more financialized, which means that economic activity more disconnected from physicality, this is an additional, or not a further tier of pressure on the environment. Because as long as you can make money out of money, this is so good. But the point is that at the end, all that money will go and buy the same material goods. At the end, we all need to have shoes, milk, meat, eggs, and then some of us need maybe the Evian water, whatever. But at the end of the day, as we create more money out of finance, virtual assets, or Karl Marx would call them maybe parasitic sectors. Academy could be one of them, but let's skip that for the moment. But yes, this is how they unite. As we financialize our economy more, actually, this is also a burden or a further tier, level, grade of pressure on the environment. This is a lot to do with the problems we are having today. There is too much money in the world seeking for profit. But in order to pay profit, you have to do some material production. And now the material production cannot satisfy the interest needs of the finance. And here we can move on, but let's stop and move further on. So what is data Anthropocene? Okay, it's getting closer, and I think we're almost there. Before that Anthropocene, we experienced the datafication. Huh? Blend, skill, knowledge turned into a common arithmetical form, a base. So lens became map, skills go bookkeeping, knowledge as maybe database. So we are moving into a new environment. The data is the new environment. Data becomes the raw material, private property, product, service, commodity. Oh, this is very similar what industrial revolution did 200 or 150 years ago. They just somehow enclosed nature, the environment, the ecology. And similarly, now AI technologies, just like industrial technologies, took over the environment, the nature, turned it into raw material to exploit. Now, AI technologies is making our cognitive environment through data is becoming private property, raw material, again. And through this, human population and human body is also treated as an economic resource, just like we treat environment. So this is what we can call, I'm calling it data Anthropocene, but I'm actually very much inspired by the concept from Matteo Pasqualini, and there's a great tradition of Italian scholars in this field, in all AI field, I have to tell, and soon we'll hear a very, very prominent member, Professor Bertolini. But let's coming to that. This is what I call a kind of a data Anthropocene, that reality is now all defined and shaped by data. So at that point, it seems to look a little bit futile. What could law do in terms of environmental law, or what could IT law can offer in terms of, regulating regulating those technologies or dynamics, phenomena. So taking this Anthropocene concept as a unifying thing, it just enables us to understand the entropic or physical limits, because we are hitting physical limits. The legal problems that we try to take on has very much to do with two kinds of depletions. One is physical in nature and the other is cognitive. So actually now we are coming to the big...
Sorry to interrupt you, but you have 2 minutes. I'm so sorry.
Perfect, perfect. This is the biggest takeaway of today. All right, this is one again common sense, intuitive thing. Societies are subject to natural laws. Actually, this is another fascinating book of Alf Hornborg, Global Magic. I hope you have the presentation, but anyway, you'll share it. Okay, the point is that if you want to make everyone live like Europe, okay, we will need 4 planet Earth. So there is no point in devising laws or policies to way out of the system we are in. It cannot, because the problems have material causes. So another great book, Cannibals and Kings, which also has a Turkish translation by Marvin Harris. So there are material causes to those problems. So we cannot solve them by putting the horse before the carriage. So the very much problem is that we tend to see law as a problem, as a question of optimization, a question of better doing, how to govern the company. Is most of the times we don't see the difference between politics and governance, because there is a one way to govern a company to make profit, but this cannot apply to other domains of life. Law is not an optimization. Law also contains antagonizations, conflicts. It has to do with political choices. But if you see law as an optimization, oh, there is a magic solution. We just can work it out. Just like there is a magic solution to environmental depletion, there is this magic solution to AI takeover whatsoever. But maybe we're getting it the wrong way. Maybe whatever problem we observe with AI, or whatever problem we observe in the environmental domain, are not the reasons. They are just the consequences. Environmental depletion is a manifestation of our social economic order. AI takeover is also a manifestation of our, will AI kill democracy? Will AI kill dignity? Will AI kill autonomy? Well, no, because we already killed it. And that's why now AI can move in. Finally, finishing, just looking at it this way, why we had industrial revolution in England? Is it because the steam engine was invented in England? Well, but there's also another way of looking at it. It was maybe because they had a slave labor force that they could carry to America and cultivate cotton in quantities that they needed machines to produce cotton. So is it a question of science? Well, yes, but science is politics by other means. Thank you.
Emre, thank you so much for this great presentation. And you introduced us with a new term, data Anthropocene, and you very well explained its scope and details. Thank you so much, and want to discuss a bit more at the Q&A session. Now, BİLGİ. We cannot hear you, BİLGİ. Yeah.
So has everyone received a copy of the presentation? I guess so. Anyway.
We have watched, we have seen. We have.
All right, great, perfect.
Thank you, Emre Hocam. It was really nice to see you, and it's always a pleasure to work with you. Leyla Hocam, I think we are working with Berkut. Okay, so our next speaker is Berkut Schaefer. He is an IT law professor at University of Edinburgh, and he is the co-founder and currently director of the Script Center for IT and IP Law. He's currently a member of the expert group of AI for People, chairing their working group on ethics framework for legal technology, and member of the data ethics group of the Turing Institute, and a member of the legal technologies accreditation panel of the Law Society of Scotland. Thank you for being with us, and it's a pleasure to see you. Please, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for the invitation. I am going to share my screen now. So, yep, that's working. Excellent. And okay, yeah. Thanks a lot for the invitation. And I think in a way, my talk builds directly on the excellent introduction that Alexa gave in a couple of ways. I was asked by the organizers to think ahead to what the future brings through AI. And as you just heard, one of my fields of interest is in particular legal technology, legal AI, and the future of the legal sector. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of my vision, what might happen in the next 2 decades, say, in the field of legal AI and what the opportunities and pitfalls are. Now, there's one way to think about legal tech that can be summarized to this screen. That was a competition between human lawyers and an AI lawyer. The AI lawyers won, given that specific task hands-on, was a type of document review. And the robots, the AIs, were not just faster and more accurate, they were drinking much less coffee. And as a result of that, obviously outperformed the humans on cost ground alone. And that is one of the visions that are sometimes presented, a competition between the human lawyer and the machine. And for lots and lots of reasons, I don't think that will happen. I don't think that the most important disruptions and the most important changes to our legal system will come through the use of technology that competes with human lawyers where they are already experts, where we are already at our best. But I think there are nonetheless some potentially quite interesting and fascinating possibilities for the future that are enabled by AI. And I want to use the 15 minutes allocated to me to speak a little bit about some of these more overlooked impacts that AI might have on law and on the legal system. And for that, I have to take a little back in history. One of my recurrent concerns is that we should not be fooled by the novelty value of the technology. Very, very often, what seems novel, what seems disruptive, what seems utterly alien, once we see it in a longer historical trajectory, are just variation of themes that we had in the past. So I would like to create a little bit of context and reset our legal system right back to 1449 and Austria. And here we have on the left Sigismund, the Archduke of Austria, and on the right we have Eleanor of Scotland, daughter of James I. And they married. They married. They look exceedingly grumpy on these pictures, but from everything we heard, they had a very lovely and comforting marriage. Eleanor was brilliant. She was an amazing woman in every respect. She spoke, amongst other things, fluently Gallic, English, French, Italian, and Latin, and she became very quickly competent in German too. And to be honest, German is one of these languages which are simply a pain in the neck to learn. So she was really, really extraordinarily in her command of language, culture, and things connected to that. And she brought quite a lot of these sort of positive attitude to learning and to language to the court of Sigismund. And in particular, one thing she did, and again, if you look at her face, grumpy face, that might surprise you a little bit. She used her linguistic skills to translate erotic novels from the Italian to German for her husband. So Boccaccio, Il Camerone, she translated that and stories like that. And I think it was this translation of erotic literature, amongst others, that positively changed Sigismund's mind toward that profession of translator. So he created a court where other intellectuals would come together, and where in particular the newly emerging scientific approach to translation would flourish. Amongst other things, one of the early humanist translator at his court was Heinrich Steinhövel, and he translated a book by Boccaccio for Eleanor, Von den sinnreichen erleuchten Weibern, die mulieribus claris, of the great women of history. It is essentially an anthology of leading women through the centuries. And I think when Heinrich Steinhövel translated that, he knew exactly who was in command of the court of Sigismund, and that was not Sigismund. So we get here a culture of translation, of humanism at this early stage. But what is most important in what Steinhövel did, he translated medical and legal texts from the Italian, French, and Latin into German. And there, for the first time, it became acceptable for learned professionals to speak in their native tongue. Previously, that had been the language of peasants, of artisans maybe, of the lower class, the working class. But in a professional context, as a medical doctor, as a scientist, as a lawyer, you wouldn't use German. That would simply be below your dignity. And because of that lead that the court took and that people like Steinhövel took, suddenly medical doctors, lawyers would feel comfortable in talking in German in their professional capacity. And that, I think, changed the way we think about law. What we find from that point onwards, and there are similar developments in other countries, obviously, is that we see on the one hand the end of a uniform European language in Latin, and we see a fragmentation of the European legal market as a result, and we see the emergence of national law linked to a national language. So the emergence of national legislation, national legal systems, national legal traditions, a breakup of the common law of Europe is driven on the one hand by technology, the printing press, and on the other hand by science in the sense of a scientific approach to translation. And if you like, a data-driven approach to translation as well, because you needed quite a bit of data and information for that. So that's what we face from the 16th century onwards. And people like Eleanor and Steinhövel, they played a massive and I think underappreciated role in the shaping of the modern law as we understand it. And that is not just a side effect of the nature of legal systems. It's obviously a gradual and evolutionary process. It doesn't have from one day to the other. But consider someone like Thomas Craig. Thomas Craig is one of the Scottish institutional writers. He's an authority. We can still cite his work in legal proceedings together with case law and statute law. The institutional writers are one of the sources of law in Scots law. Thomas Craig did his undergraduate degree in humanities in St. Andrews, but he did his legal studies in Paris. He studied canon law and civil law in Paris. He came back with that continental European knowledge and transplanted it to Scotland. So the emergence of Scots law as a distinct legal system, as a mixed legal system, was facilitated, enabled by that uniform European legal language, the ability of a lawyer to move effortlessly from one country to another, practice there, talk in the language of the law in that place. And that is now disappearing. That is now disappearing. And again, if you look at today, the higher university system, law remains one of the least mobile disciplines. Look at informatics departments, you will find a broad spread of nationalities there. Look at law schools, that is very, very different in the majority of countries because we have that co-evolution of national languages and national legal systems. And that had a profound impact, both in terms of opportunities, but also of disadvantages. On the one hand, as I said, the European legal market in legal services fragments at that time, but at the same time, we get access of the ordinary people to the law. Because if you control the medium, you control the message. This is a text of a early English legal document, and it is totally ununderstandable. It's a mixture of French, Latin, and other things. This was a language for the learned and the educated only. It would be totally beyond ordinary citizens. So it was impossible or difficult prior to that development for the citizens to know what their law was, because it was not speaking in their language. So we have on the one hand uniformity in Europe that enables lawyers to move effortlessly between legal systems. At the same time, we have a disconnect, a barrier of access between citizenship and the legal profession and the law. And this is now changing through humanism. We lose the uniform European legal market and create access barriers. And at the same time, we remove access barriers for our own citizenship. So what does this all have to, well, this is just one example, how it then becomes codified. That's from Germany, Article 184 of the Legal Procedure Act. German is the language of the court. There are small exceptions in Saxony and Brandenburg. You're allowed to submit in Sorbic. But the correct language is a precondition for legal procedures. Any submission to a German court that is not written in German is invalid automatically. And that is a problem, obviously, and for a European uniform market, for a vision that allows citizens in Europe to move from one country to another. So the European Union pushes back against that. There's Directive 2010-64 that gives at least defense in criminal cases an automatic right to get translation. But that is, if you like, the legacy of the 16th century and the legacy of the printing press and scientific translation. So we have better access to justice to ordinary people from then forward onward, if you are a native speaker, if you are a majority language speaker, and if you are a non-dialectal speaker. And at the same time, we created higher barriers to access for foreign lawyers. Now, where does AI come in? AI comes in because one of the massive success stories is, I think, automated translation. And the improvements we have seen, even with tools like Google Translate, are astonishing. And the ability to use huge amounts of data from massive users on the internet to teach these machines have resulted in a dramatic change in the quality of legal translation. So now I think, and if you look at some of the figures of how many legal documents are already automatically translated, that is, I think, where you see the economic value. This is way ahead of legal expert systems, decision support tools of any shape or color in terms of actual deployment in practice and commercial value. So my vision, my disruptive vision for the next 15 years is that we potentially get back to the past. We can reset what happened and went wrong in 1449. We can maintain access for the population to the law because it still speaks in their language, but we can also reduce the barriers of access to foreigners. We can recreate the uniform legal market enabled by AI and enabled by better and better automated translation. So that is what I meant with the Great Reset. And I think for the nature of law, that could be fundamental if you remember how essential in shaping modern legal systems that convergence of the emerging nation state, national languages, and national legal systems was. If we revert that, then how the law of the future will look like is, I think, very much up for grasps. So that is the positive vision, but building a little bit on what Alexa said, there are potentially also pitfalls. The dark side of automated translation. One of them is it works better now because it is data-driven. And we moved away from the Chomskyan vision that machine translation needs formal representation of grammar to a data-driven approach. The more data you have about a language, the better it works. And that essentially means if you speak one of the languages with lots of speakers, the accuracy will be high: English, Chinese, Russian, potentially Arabic. Minority languages will potentially left out. And we do have in Europe a legal system that also tries to protect minority languages. Some of them in law. In the UK, we have Welsh and Gaelic as recognized minority languages. There is hardly any reliable machine translation for them. In Austria, we have Croatian, Romani, Czech, Slovak, Hungarian, and Slovene as legally recognized minority languages with legal documents that have to be in that language based on the Austrian State Treaty from 1995 and the European Charter of Regional and Minority Languages. What happens to these languages if we move to machine translation as the intermediate mode of communication. So that is one of the dangers here. Will they be pushed out simply because there are no working algorithms for them? And then finally, again, that even closer to what Alexa says, at the moment, AIs talk in female, but listen in male. Alexa talks with a soothing female voice, as does Cortina and Tay and all the others. They are, after all, assistants. Yeah? But they don't listen in female, they listen in male. And the UN report, for instance, had identified that female frequencies are often much less accurately understood by these tools than male voices. So on the one hand, we might see here a massive limitation of linguistic boundaries, and with that, a much better access to justice. But we are indeed bedeviled by all these pitfalls of biased development in AI that we already heard upon. And this is one of the obvious ones, gender bias in AI, and the other one, bias against minority languages, languages with small amounts of speakers. And if I see the clock on the right-hand side correctly, this is the absolute first time in my academic career that I will finish exactly on the allocated time, which is right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Berkut. The timing is perfect. Thanks again, and thank you for your presentation.
Now, I would like to invite Michael Weil for his speech, to deliver his speech. Michael Weil joined the UCL Faculty of Laws as lecturer in digital rights and regulation in 2019. His expertise sits at the crossover of computer science and technology law, particularly in the context of fundamental rights and advanced data analysis, including machine learning and artificial intelligence. And his recent publications focus on a critical take on the policy recommendations of the EU high-level expert group on artificial intelligence, decentralized privacy-preserving proximity tracing, and the administration by algorithm, public management meets public sector machine learning, and lastly, the algorithms in criminal justice system and governing machine learning that matters. Now, welcome again, Michael, and your title is Encrypted Data Analysis, Promise and Perils. We are really excited about to hear you.
Thanks. Can you see the slides?
Yep.
I just didn't know which part of the screen it was sharing. Cool. So thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me here. I'm going to talk about an ongoing trend that I think hasn't received enough attention. And it challenges some of our understanding about AI and how to govern it. Whoops. So we've seen this powerful figure, right? We've seen Mark Zuckerberg, and he's a big player in AI in practice. Of course, when he's he's less towering when you notice his booster seat. But still, we see these large players, and they're very important in the development of AI. And similarly, we also see that they're posturing a lot in terms of privacy. So we see that Facebook fairly recently gave a lot of talk saying the future is private, our entire system can be encrypted, so that Facebook can't see what's going on. And it can work between Instagram and WhatsApp and other Facebook properties. So this seems a bit strange in some ways, because what we have been told about AI repeatedly is it requires loads of data. You need to put data in one place. You need to analyze it, and that's its power, and that's how you learn. Today, I'm going to make the argument that access to data will become increasingly worthless, that optimization systems, which is what they are, can function without centrally decryptable data using new cryptographic techniques, and that we need to move away from understanding privacy as confidentiality. And it's not how all scholars have always been understanding it, but it's how companies would like us to understand it, perhaps, because it no longer solves the problems we see in society, and we may see when we focus on the infrastructures behind artificial intelligence. To do so, we're going to have a bit of a tour to the zoo of crypto systems and find out what's on the horizon for technologies. So apologies if this isn't new to some people. One technology I want to introduce you to is called secure multi-party computation. a secure multi-party computation protocol allows lots of individuals to collectively compute an aggregate function over data that they all hold pieces of, but they don't have to reveal any of those pieces to any other player in this system. So in this diagram, you can see that these three phones have collectively computed a function of A, B, and C. That could be, the addition of them all, or it could be a machine learning model trained over these three parts of data. But indeed, none of the other phones, so the phone that says A, didn't see B or C. They communicated, and out the end pops this function that was a result of these three things, that took these three things as input. But no single actor saw all these three things in one place, or even saw anything apart from the piece they held themselves. And that's important for what some people think of as privacy when it's considered for confidentiality, because it means that you can say that player A never saw B or C, confidentiality was assured, but we got the output of all those three pieces. Multi-party computation can happen in a very decentralized way, like on the right, or it can also happen in a sort of delegated way, like on the left. In this case, phones share secrets. They split up the data they have into several parts and send one part to each part to a different cloud server. And these cloud servers interact with each other in the same way as the phones did on the right-hand side. That's commonly used compared to the example on the right for efficiency. And of course, it requires you to assume that these cloud servers can be trusted not to talk to each other except through this protocol, which you might do through contractual means or some other approach. So it does have some trust assumptions there, but that's a common way you set it up. Another technology that's important to know is called homomorphic encryption. This is encryption that retains its structure when it's transformed. So you can encrypt data and then you can operate on it. So you could double it and then you could decrypt it and you'd get the doubled result back. So effectively, while the data is encrypted, you can't see what it is, but you can operate on it. And then when you give it to someone to decrypt who has the key, they'll see the result. So it allows you, say, to apply what could be a secret algorithm or over data and have somebody decrypt the result and find the result of that operation without the operator of the algorithm knowing what the data was. It could also allow you to delegate your complicated computation to a cloud server you don't trust. So you want to move your data and do operations on it, and you don't want to do it on your own device, maybe because of cost or efficiency or scale. So you put it in the cloud, but you don't trust the cloud. So you use homomorphic encryption. Yeah, just described this. I give you the encrypted data, you manipulate it, learn the result, and return the result. I decrypt it, and I never learned the algorithm, and you never saw my data. As I mentioned, there are different structures for using this. The edge computing approach is quite extreme, that users calculate amongst themselves. But when you have millions of users, you've got millions of lines between everyone and everyone else, and that's very inefficient. And it doesn't really work because the communication efficiency is very low, and that's what really eats into the ability to do it in practice. So in practice, we often use the bottom system where there's some central authorities that we believe don't collude with each other. So that was in theory, and I want to show you now why these are relevant and show you some examples of these being used in the wild. So one example is, as always, all technology innovation starts a lot of technology innovation does start historically in farming and agriculture and transformation. And we've seen Emre, for example, talk about the importance of revolutions in the past and in the way that technology is shaped. And this one, this use of multi-party computation started in Denmark. Denmark surprisingly does grow sugar, and sugar beet it grows. But Denmark, unsurprisingly, doesn't grow sugar very efficiently. So in Denmark, the WTO, I think on the request of Thailand and Australia, challenged sugar beet subsidies that were ongoing in Denmark. And this meant that Denmark had to reorganize its sugar beet market to be more efficient and be in line with WTO rules. It needed to find a realistic market price that its sugar beet farmers were willing to sell to its monopoly buyer. It had a monopoly buyer of agricultural products in the country. So it needed a nationwide double auction to find the supply and demand curves that you have in economics, to find out what everybody's willing to supply it at, and then what the monopoly buyer is willing to buy it at what price, so quantity and price. Then you find the clearing price that the market will function at. The problem is that 80% of farmers were really concerned that their productivity information would be exploited. If we knew how much they'd be willing to pay, if they to sell their products for, if they were guaranteed a lot of purchases, then they could be exploited. So with Aarhus University in Denmark, the country used secure multi-party computation. The sugar beet farmers submitted into a web form how much they would be willing to sell for and at what price, and the monopoly buyer submitted how much they would be willing to buy for and what for. And this was decentralized through several servers, and a secure multi-party computation was run such that the market price was revealed, but the data was never in anybody's hands. So that looks pretty cool. We got to an outcome without having to go through those steps. Like we had our cake and we ate it. Okay. Similarly, there's an example in Boston. The Boston Women's Workforce Council wanted to calculate the gender pay gap in the city, but countries are unwilling to share individualized salary data for reasons of competition. So they also used a web-based multi-party computation system where companies entered individualized data, but aggregate data across all the companies was produced. So this is, for example, for calculations where companies producing their own aggregates that might be sensitive, or they might just not be sufficient for calculating what you need to know across an entire sector. So that also looks cool. Let's look at something a bit more sinister. So Google and MasterCard were working together in this particular approach. Sometimes it's hard for advertisers to know what advertising works. And much online advertising doesn't actually work, it seems. But for example, if you are if you're trying to buy a pair of shoes online, then you might click on the ad for shoes, and it might take you to the shoe shop. You might then buy the shoes. And at that point, the organization that's selling the shoes could tell the advertiser that was a successful ad, and the publisher, the newspaper you clicked from, might get paid more. So that works. But what if it was a car? You're probably not going to click through and buy the car immediately unless you're very, very spontaneous. Or if it's, you know, a soft drink that you might buy in the shop when you go next time to the shop. So in that case, it's harder to attribute success of advertising. Google knows what you saw and what you clicked, and MasterCard knows what you spent offline. And what if you could combine the two to find out this data? And this is what Google and MasterCard did. They paired up and used a crypto system, partially based on homomorphic encryption, called private set intersection. And what this does is this effectively combines these data sets cryptographically and produces the result. The result is how much money people who saw an advert spent on that single advertiser. So the input, two parties with personal data, shared identifiers. The output was aggregate non-personal data on the spend of those who saw the ads per campaign. So this campaign led to this much spending in aggregate. So that's not personal data. You know, this Coke ad brought in, you know, £500,000. Okay, so the result here, like, fine, you think, okay, that's not the same as Women's Workforce Council. Maybe it's acceptable. But where does it stop? Is it then okay to connect with a hospital to ask about health data, to ask if people with certain mental health conditions click on ads more likely? You know, this ad was more successful with people who are dyslexic. This ad was more successful with people who are anxious or nervous. This ad was more successful with people of certain ethnicities. So is that acceptable? Is it a free-for-all? Then we enter into the world of research ethics. Which questions are ethical to ask? Rather than all questions are fine as long as the data remains private that's used to ask them. So we move into that other zone, and privacy can't help us completely there because there are other questions at stake. Perhaps the most extreme is a large trend we see here, local personalization. So I've called it, let's do it at my place instead. The argument here is, can we target users, micro-target them in the same way we do currently, but without data leaving their devices at all? So we're worried about advertising online. We're worried about sometimes we're worried about manipulation. Sometimes we're worried about the fact that data is flowing everywhere in the ad ecosystem and we can't control it. What if we got rid of the latter problem and said data no longer flows everywhere, but we can target you very granularly on your device. Your phone records everything about you. It records your web browsing history. It records your health data, maybe even your pulse. And we'll use this to deliver you adverts. And we'll use systems like multi-party computation to train machine learning systems across the entire population so we can have good targeting, so we can predict well. And indeed, there are systems that are being built to do this. And Google is pushing one called Flock in their privacy sandbox using Google Chrome. And we're going to see other companies do this in the near future. These companies might even start to make normal browsing or online behavior conditional on running this system. So your phones, we no longer control the code that runs on our phones because of operating systems. It's not like a PC. The potential of these phones to run whatever we want is mediated through the operating system, through the App Store restrictions. So these phones can, using hardware and software and also cryptographic methods, say, we won't let you see this website unless you agree to being targeted in this way and prove to us that you're allowing this targeting to run. So it can be quite coercive. And as I said, it's exacerbated by walled gardens. And now this becomes a bit creepy because on one hand, we solve the problem of lack of confidentiality. We solve the problem of somebody could actually find out that one piece of information about your browsing history. But we start to say manipulation can go wild. We start to say that your device can learn and target and adapt to you in ways that you might find very uncomfortable and that might be very, very personal and intimate. And we have to separate out these societal problems a little bit. We also see that this is a problem for competition because this is, it gives operating systems even more power over these protocols and reduces the ability of other actors to contest or to offer alternative systems of targeting. When we look at cryptographic papers, we see a kind of naive, I don't know what's going on here. We see a bit of a naive narrative. So here's a paper on homomorphic encryption that suggests that homomorphic encryption could be really great for detecting at-risk students that might drop out. And our main problem here is because the integration of data is sensitive. So if fine, it usually requires integrating data across police, schools, hospitals, welfare systems, police departments to predict dropouts. But now we can get the result of this risk assessment from all this data without having really touched it. So we can start to give people interventions based on their police record, based on their welfare record, but without the school or any other actor having combined this explicitly. And we see here, this hasn't really solved the problem. This actually maybe enables the problem to continue because the problem was not one of confidentiality here. We also see Philip Rogaway, who is a cryptographer, and he was writing after the Snowden revelations, state that cryptographers often assume that cryptography benefits the weak because, for example, individuals can encrypt data in a way that a state can no longer touch or decrypt. But it really depends how it's configured. Cryptographic primitives, if they're embedded into systems incorrectly, realize power in ways that can go against the users quite clearly. And we see that maybe in digital rights management and for example, how copyright has emerged. So to conclude, my talk illustrates, I think, that privacy as confidentiality needs to be distinguished from informational power. Privacy as confidentiality doesn't protect us against informational power and infrastructural power. Societies have to be careful when they enable these tools because they allow us to ask a lot of questions of a lot of very sensitive and private and intimate data, but not all questions are good to ask. And we need to learn from research ethics around this, not just privacy and confidentiality as we move into privacy technologies, and not think that privacy technologies solve these big ethical questions of what information and aggregate information it is okay to know. Data protection does actually have a hook here. So in Europe, data protection case law does not assume that controllers need to see the data in its raw form. It doesn't assume that controllers actually have access to the data. You can be a controller without seeing the data. But a lot of the rights and obligations start to make a lot less sense when we work with that assumption to its natural conclusion. So we have to work out the kinks and see if that regime actually does help us here or if it needs to be rethought in light of its inability to protect us against the harms of privacy-enhancing technologies. So lastly, data processing must be legitimate, not just confidential. Users should get practical visibility and control over the code that runs on their device, else they can't defend themselves against being coerced in this way. Services like cloud services should not be made conditional on running certain code on your device. And experimentation on users and learning about them, even if you never see the results explicitly, is still experimentation and requires research ethics to be considered. And private companies may need to venture into that zone as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michael, for this great presentation. We have a lot of takeaways from your presentation, and I would like to discuss at the Q&A session particularly, but very specific, special thanks for explaining homomorphic encryption and its usage as a privacy enhancing tools. Thank you. Vidi?
Thank you, Hocam. And now we are moving to Andrea Bertolini. Andrea is Assistant Professor of Private Law at Dear Policy Institute and Adjunct Professor in Private Law at University of Pisa. His research ranges from private law, contracts, torts, and law of obligations to technology regulation, in particular robotics and AI, and bioethics with a comparative and law and economics approach. He is one of the authors of AI and Civil Liability Report. Thanks for being with us, accepting our invitation. The floor is yours, Andrea.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you today, even if I would have much rather been there in Istanbul than here in Pisa. But yes, it's really nice to be here and among these very smart intellectuals and some friends as well. So the things I will be touching upon are these four fundamental points. I'll be talking about AI and robotics quite indistinctively, even if they are two different fields, of course, from a technical point of view. But in a social science perspective, they display relevant similarities in the kind of issues they trigger, even if the answer ought to be very, very diversified, but not just within AI and robotics, but also in terms of classes of application, but I will get to that in a moment. So the first question I want to ask is whether those advanced technologies are old tools or game changers. So whether they do require a radical shift in the legal system and on which grounds eventually. Then I'll try to introduce a functional approach that is a very bottom-up approach to understanding advanced technologies. And in light of that, I will discuss very briefly, because of time constraints, but I'm happy to pick more detailed questions if there are any, the current European framework, in particular, the Pro-Liability Directive. And then I'll introduce my alternative proposal that I like to call the risk management approach. And I'll try to show how liability rules basically shape technological development and how and why we need to regulate liability at a European level. The content of what I will be presented today is reflecting the study on civil liability and AI that I recently wrote for the European Parliament. So basically, I'm going through some of the relevant points that I discussed there. So the first question is, and that it's a very recurring question, whether robotics and AI are radically new game changers. And typically you'll hear people say, are they agents? Do they possess rights? Do they maybe then be held responsible for the damages they cause? And the short answer is certainly no. Even if there are some provocative articles such as that by Floridi that says that a smart thermostat might be deemed an artificial moral agent and therefore responsible for its actions, its conducts, and the damage that it might cause, and eventually that would deserve punishment in itself rather than the human being using it. I find those statements, despite eventually thought-provoking, quite wrong in technical terms, I would say, from a technological, legal, and philosophical perspective, but also very useless in terms of policy. And I do really believe that, and I think we can clearly say today that there are no technological grounds to argue that any existing or reasonably foreseeable technological application displays a form of strong autonomy that is reflecting that of human beings that would justify treating them as agents and therefore even responsible. Machines, there's no machine that is capable of deciding for itself. We are ever more developing a weak approach to AI rather than a strong approach. We're not trying to replicate the human brain. And even if those attempts are far from reaching any relevant conclusion, we have very sometimes smart applications, sometimes not so smart. I have Alexa at home and I have to say it's far from being smart. There's nothing that ontologically allows us to consider those as beings, much less agents. They do not perceive their own existence, they do not have their own preferences, and they cannot coordinate their actions towards achieving those self-determined ends. So what we can appreciate today at most is some form of weak autonomy to be intended as the ability to intelligently interact eventually with no or limited human supervision. And even the possibly the ability of the machine to learn that leads to some degree of unforeseeability is not so radical and per se does not suffice. Only stronger autonomy would suffice, but we're far from achieving it. So this ability of pursuing the machine's own ends. But I would also say, luckily so, in a utilitarian perspective, I really like the instrumental approach to technology, whereby technology is a tool that human beings use for their own ends and interests. So to summarize and leave this issue to the side, I really believe that for the time being and for a long period of time, actually, we are safe saying that the producer or programmer is responsible for the consequences, the harmful consequences arising from the use of a robot or AI system, because without them, those applications would not possess those skills and abilities. So under all circumstances, I think we can run a but-for test and say that a human being is liable, and we can identify a human being that is liable for the negative consequences arising from the use of a given advanced technology. Now, an entirely different question is whether which one among the possible human beings shall be held responsible, but that is a functional question, and we'll get to that in a moment. So it's a very different approach in the analysis. One thing is to say machines need new regulation because they are ontologically radically new. And another thing is saying we have to assess existing and applicable liability rules and see and find those that we could apply instead because they would provide better incentives. This is the functional approach, the law and economics approach that I follow. So disregarding all sorts of considerations about machines possessing human traits and being requiring the attribution of rights and obligations, something that is not even an interesting, in my perspective, intellectual exercise. We need to clarify that this doesn't correspond to the notion of the electronic personhood that was once advanced by the European Parliament back in 2017. In its current statements, more recent statements, the European Parliament basically denied the utility of the notion of electronic personhood, said there's no reason to grant machines rights and obligations, like stepping back from its previous statements dating back to 2017. I have to say I have never been a great fan of the electronic personhood myself, but things need to be clarified because the notion of electronic personhood dating back to 2017 was a purely instrumental concept that as lawyers we're quite acquainted with. It's the notion of legal personhood, basically what the parliament was saying. In some cases, you might want to attribute legal personhood as you do to corporations also to machines. And what the purposes might be to allow for robot registration or AI system registration, allow insurance and regulation to be applicable, that the insurance requirements and regulation to be directly applicable to the machine rather than to the people behind it. So there might be cases that on purely technical legal grounds might allow us to consider these as a viable option, an alternative to other approaches. I typically prefer a one-stop shop approach in liability, so identifying one single entry point for litigation. I will try to explain that in a moment when I get to my risk management approach, but this could achieve a similar end. And in some cases, if it's particularly difficult to identify the people that are behind the use of an AI-based system, that could be a viable alternative. It's quite peculiar that people such as Floridi, that wrote that article claiming that a thermostat could be deemed an artificial moral agent, then also signed a document stating that they are very squarely against the notion of electronic personhood. But leaving aside intellectual coherence, I would say it is this purely instrumental notion is clearly distinct from the ontological argument that other philosophers and intellectuals make, claiming that machines ought to be held directly responsible. That is clearly on ontological grounds for what they are. Quite frankly, if machines actually did display a degree, some form of strong autonomy, so were capable of having their own interests, their own and pursuing their own ends, it would even be easier to regulate them because they would fear the same sanctions that human beings do fear, and we could treat them similarly. So we wouldn't need to make such a strong effort in regulating them. Whereas because they do not display strong autonomy, we have to conceive adequate incentives for the human beings that use the technology, and that is certainly much more complicated. If the thermostat by Floridi feared being distracted or disconnected, maybe regulating it and making it responsible would have sense. But because it doesn't even know that it exists, because it's just a thing, telling that, well, if you do that, I'll disconnect you or I'll destroy you, I don't think it will sort any effect. So another consideration that is very useful for non-lawyers, if there are any among the audience. This is a citation by a very famous Italian professor that also was a judge of the Italian Constitutional Court. He once said in one of his books, the law is not a brick that falls upon your head. And what I want to, what I'm trying to say by that is that even if we invented the time machine overnight, the time machine would immediately be regulated, because if somebody suffered any harm using time travel the next day, and he himself directly or his heirs sued the one that conceived the time machine in a court, that judge would have to find a solution in any way. So he would have to apply other general principles of tort law or any other legal norm that he would deem analogically fit for the purpose. So this is to say that we should, when we discuss technology regulation, we should keep this, bear this in mind, that it's never the option whether to regulate or not to regulate, but only how to regulate, because everything is already regulated. So this is also leading me to say that we really need to adopt a bottom-up approach, because innovation happens bottom-up, and we need to understand what technology is. So we can only regulate technology, and in particular liability, which is what I'm discussing right now, if we understand the technology and we understand what is the game-changing element, which is was very clear in the presentation that just preceded mine. Understanding the details of the technology and its function is essential to understand the legal analysis that is built upon it. But this is indeed a game changer, because typically lawyers are taught to think top-down, from general to special, whereas here in technology regulation, when you consider how technology ought to be regulated, if there is a need to change the existing legal framework, you have to have a bottom-up approach. And this, for instance, is essential when you discuss AI or robotics, because this is just a little sample of AI-based applications. This is my toothbrush, and then I have Alexa, that I have at home, and there is IBM Watson that is, well, I hope everybody knows what it is, but anyway, it's an expert system that can be used in the legal field or in medical consultancy. And then you have a countless AI-based application in finance, so-called fintech. All these are deemed AI-based systems, and yet they differ substantially one from the other. If one wanted to address them unitarily, you would have to go through a great degree of simplification. And not only that, also the kind of concerns that they might trigger are substantially different. I don't have any feel that there is a need for specific regulation with respect to smart toothbrushes. For Alexa, yes, maybe, but in a different perspective for different reasons on that matter, for instance, but it's not the topic for today. I would discuss human-machine interaction and the problem of human deception and manipulation through technology. That is another topic that is very dear to me. But if you discuss Watson, well, then that might impact the legal profession in a way, but it could also impact the medical profession in another way. And the solution you might want for the one field or the other might not be the same, because you might want to provide different incentives. And when it gets to fintech, it's clear that you cannot regulate fintech the same way as you regulate the toothbrush, because today we do not regulate the sales of consumer goods the same way we regulate the financial markets, you know, and the liability of intermediaries there. So the same thing could be said about robots. You cannot even conceive an I'm sorry, I don't know why it changed. An all-encompassing definition of robot, because all these applications are so different one from the other. So from left to right, you see a robotic hand that is implanted onto the human body and abides the instructions provided by the human body smoothly. At least this is in the hope of its designers. And so it has a physical body and it is not autonomous. Watson might be deemed a softbot, a software robot, and it is deprived of a physical body and it is instead autonomous. Then you have the Da Vinci surgical system, again, non-autonomous and with a body, but non-autonomous in a completely different way than the robotic hand. Then you have the driverless car that has a physical body and it is to some extent autonomous. And then you have Dustbot, that is a garbage collecting robot that we developed at Sant'Anna, and that is partially autonomous and it operates without human direct supervision. So all these are robotic applications. I could have given 100 examples, and they're all so diverse. If I wanted to regulate them unitarily, that would be highly problematic and actually a very frustrating experience, and even more so, very inefficient, because there is no single common trait that allows them to put all in one category, and they do not trigger the same issues in a legal and societal perspective. So we really need to have a functional approach. A functional approach, a bottom-up, I don't know why my slides are changing. A functional approach, a bottom-up approach highlights the profound technical differences that characterize all these different sorts of application and favors a case-by-case approach, or you could say a class of application by class of application. So we should group technologies that display a certain high degree of similarities and regulate those according to the problems they pose. And we should also be careful, because a similar, if not identical, technological trait might not give rise to the same legal issues. The autonomy of a Roomba, so a vacuum cleaner, and the autonomy of a driverless cars, despite being somewhat similar because their autonomy allows them to move without human supervision, do not give rise to the same legal issue. They're not as complicated, and they do not have the same identical societal impact, not in terms of novelty, not even in terms of potential dangers they might trigger, not even in terms of opportunities they might they might bring about. So at the same time, even the same legal issue, liability, which is what we are discussing right now, might require different solutions. And these based upon the structure of the incentives that you might identify by applying existing norms, but also market forces and characteristics of that are applicable to single technology. So for instance, if you wanted to regulate driverless cars, you might assume that there is a market for insurance for driverless cars, because there is already a market for insurance for non-driverless cars. And I don't see why insurance companies should not have an interest in remaining in that industry. Whereas if you're considering advanced robotic prostheses, there are much less users that need them, implantees. Those applications have great cost, and in a future perspective, they might even give rise to relevant harms because they can be used in countless domains. Think in how many scenarios my hand is used, and if that were a robotic hand, I could do the same thing theoretically that I do with my natural hand. So I could use that robotic hand to drive a car, to carry my food shopping, or to train in the gym. And the same identical malfunctioning of from a technical point of view occurring in one of those different situations might lead to very different consequences. Now, if I wanted to insure against all those damages, it would be very hard for an insurance company to quantify the potential risk and offer me an insurance product. If they did, it would cost me a lot of money. So in such cases, there might be, I'm not sure that there is, but there might be grounds to observe a market failure, and you might want to conceive alternative tools. So in those cases, insurance solutions might not be the best one. So in this functional bottom-up approach, understanding the technology, understanding the societal implication of that technology, understanding the market for that technology are the pillars for conducting any relevant analysis, even when it comes to liability. So if we...
I'm really sorry for interrupting, but we are a bit out of time. Is it possible for you to wrap up within...
Oh, I already finished my 15 minutes?
Yes.
Sorry.
Please.
Okay, I'll try to wrap up. I still had some slides. Well, very quickly then, if robots and AI applications are products and therefore things and product liability rules apply, well, I will not show it to you. I'll leave it. Well, what we can say is that there are grounds, if you look into the current liability framework at European level, to say that the product liability directive does not work. It's applied in a very little number of cases. We only have 547 cases of product liability litigated across Europe, 25 member states from 2000 to 2016. All having to do with non-technologically sophisticated products. Instead, however, if we deemed these applications to be products, we know that this body of legislation will apply. So if this body of legislation that is today with not such sophisticated and technologically advanced products is not really functional, it's not really efficient, then if we want to apply the same body of legislation to more technologically advanced products, well, that will not be working. And we have a number of grounds that I cannot explain now because of time constraints to come up with this conclusion. So what is my alternative proposal? And I'll finish with this. Well, what I propose is to adopt a risk management perspective. So I do believe that when it comes to advanced technologies, we should try to hold the party liable that is best placed to minimize costs and risks and acquire insurance. This opposes to a full center perspective that is very much based on the blame for failing to comply with the desired standard of conduct. And in this risk management perspective, you might want to adopt a one-stop shop approach and absolute liability rules that hold one single party liable ex ante, radically simplifying the existing legal framework. This would ensure prompt compensation to the victim and virtually no litigation. Very briefly, if you consider driverless cars as a viable example, currently the major risk you have is that with increased automation, there will be, we don't go from day one to day two, from no automation to full automation. We'll have time where vehicles with different levels of automation coexist on public roads. And this will make the assessment of liability extremely complex because theoretically there might be the driver that is responsible, the owner of the vehicle that is responsible, the infrastructure manager that might be held responsible together with the internet service provider that makes the vehicle connect with one another for each vehicle. So you might have like litigation between 10 different parties for a two-car accident. So this could be extremely costly and leave all the liability upon the owner of the vehicle, discouraging early adoption of this technology. So if instead we applied a risk management approach and we held the producer absolutely liable for all damages deriving from the use of a driverless car or even partially autonomous, what we could expect him to do is that he would acquire insurance that would transform exposed uncertainty into an ex ante certain cost, that of the insurance, and that he would probably incorporate in the resale price of his vehicle. So whomever buys the car will buy the car as an insured object, and this will pull and spread all costs associated. Whomever suffer harm from the use of a driverless car could that way sue the producer and obtain compensation without the need of litigation. And then later on, once he has paid, he would still be granted rights to act in regress against all the different parties that are along the value chain, all the different suppliers of components, as well as the managers of the infrastructure and so on and so forth. In my recent law and economics paper, I showed that such a solution would help minimize the cost for the owner of the vehicle, and that would allow him to prefer an autonomous vehicle as soon as, like in the right equation, right equation, the performance function of the vehicle equals that of the average human driver, as opposed to what happens in the left equation, whereby with the current legislation, it would only make sense to adopt a driverless car when it far exceeds by many folds the ability of the average human driver. So this is a way to speed up innovation. Reforming liability by making the producer liable could be a way to speed up innovation and the uptake of this technology. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a really great presentation, and it was a really good evaluation of different perspectives of regulation of AI. And I would like to give the floor to Leyla Hoca.
Thank you, BİLGİ. And we have Carlos Afonso Souza, who is a great colleague of us, and he gives continuous support to our Istanbul Privacy Symposium, and he is a very active member of the network of centers. Welcome, Carlos. And he's the director of the Institute of Technology and Society of Rio de Janeiro and professor of law, Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro, visiting professor, University of Ottawa Law School, and affiliated fellow, Information Society Project, Yale Law School. Carlos, welcome again.
Thank you, Leyla. Thank you, BİLGİ. It's really a pleasure to be here in this virtual edition of the Istanbul Privacy Symposium. It's really great to see you all and to be able to engage in this lively conversation on what the future holds concerning AI. I just need to send out a warning before I begin. First of all, I will be quick because I understand we have some time constraints here. And second, I'm in a hotel room, so I have no control whatsoever on the books and in my background. I just realized right before Andrea finished his presentation that I had a teddy bear here in my background. I took it away, but I'm not sure if I'm missing something. So if I do, I just need to make sure that I have, as Leyla has said, I'm director of ITS Rio, so focusing mostly on issues on internet regulation, education, innovation, and thinking about how technology and democracy intertwine in Brazil and in our region in Latin America and the Caribbean. ITS has been one of the coordinators of the DNOC, the Global Network of Internet Society Research Centers in the past. And through DNOC, we have organized back in 2017 already in Rio, a nice symposium on AI and inclusion. And we are really proud of this event, not only because of the amount of great minds that we were able to bring down to Rio to this discussion. And our friends from the BİLGİ University were there as well. But also because putting inclusion alongside AI as the topic of the event, I still think it's something quite relevant for us to reflect on this future in which AI will play a pivotal role in everyone's life, especially coming from the global south. The idea of inclusion, it seems like a very important element for us to keep track on. And I just want to mention, if you want to have access to the materials of these events, we have all the lectures, all the presentations. You can go to aiandinclusion.org. This is just the URL that you can see up on the screen. It might be a good entry point for those who are beginning to get into research and to study issues related to AI and inclusion mostly. So the focus of this panel, it's a very broad and a very provocative question, what the future holds concerning AI, focusing on opportunities and pitfalls. And what I would like to do is to offer a glimpse of what this future could look like through the lenses of AI national strategies. They all seem to be almost everywhere now that you turn, you see an AI national strategy. They do share a common language, and different states, of course, might end up through those different national strategies, setting out different priorities, different approaches, and they might have different long-term visions on how AI will end up producing economic, political, and cultural changes to their population, and how this country might be perceived by peers, by other countries in the world. So I really think that a way for us to understand a bit what the future holds concerning AI is to take a look on how countries are getting ready to implement their own AI national strategies. And one thing that I believe it's interesting for us to take a look on, because promises and challenges that we already see laid out on those strategies end up showing us quite nicely not only the differences between approaches, but also how different strategies might be played out by states, sometimes trying to replicate what has been going well in the past concerning other types of information technologies and communications. For some other states, it's a new beginning. So it's an opportunity for them to become a global player on a discussion in which they might be lagging behind. But I think it's quite important for us to pay attention on how AI could become an element to bridge the gap among countries, or could be something that might have the opposite way. So in order to do that, on ITS, we have prepared a study that so far is only in Portuguese, and it's still a draft that I'm presenting here, but we will come up with an English version by the beginning of next year, analyzing more than 20 national strategies on AI. We have developed small cards with summaries and key takeaways from each national strategy from several different countries, and you can see that on our website. But then again, an English version is coming up next year, and we're focusing mostly on how different strategies end up tackling issues concerning research, industry development, and language around the idea of ethics and principles. And it's interesting for us to take a look on those three tracks, and I'll go super quick on some of the takeaways that we can see from national strategies. As I was saying, and this is something that we can take away from a UNESCO study from 2018 that's called Towards a Monopolization of Research in AI. It's important to understand how AI might bridge or enlarge the gap between nations. And this is something that is pretty much clear when it comes to research. When we see how specific countries and specific regions are quickly positioning themselves as the leaders in research. And of course, if the research is successful and applications of AI end up coming along after those successful researchers, that we will end up consolidating a leading position for those nations. And that means that those who are not able to catch up will end up being served with the results of someone else's research. And it has been like this, of course, in previous technological trends, but it's important to see if we're affirming here that AI will bring along such an essential revolution to everyone's lives. Of course, the differences that we are talking here, they end up being crucial on the individual level, but also on how a country positions itself in the global stage. So when we look on national strategies, you have different ways of setting up a discussion on research. Some national strategies end up focusing on creating one AI research center that will end up serving as a long arm of the state in providing cutting edge research on AI. Some other national strategies end up resorting to a cluster of centers, focusing on specific for larger countries on regional centers that might tackle a specificity, some elements of one specific region. So if you do have a country in which you have an important rural area, a lot of effort on IoT for agriculture and development of AI applications might be the focus of this specific AI research center that will end up operating in this one specific region. And you can see this discussion being played in different national strategies. But I think it's important to mention that Canada, UK, China, for instance, they end up going with the idea of a cluster of centers and dividing them sometimes regionally, sometimes thematically. It is important on research to mention that a lot of national strategies end up focusing on building domestic capacity building, on teaching people skills related to AI, and especially for developing countries and countries in the global south, you see a clear concern on brain drain, on the idea that your key research on AI, someone that might have just graduated from an university in your home country, will end up doing his master or doctoral level formation abroad. This person might not come back, and you end up losing the talent of this one person. And of course, if you enlarge this analysis, this can be something that is extremely worrisome. And you can see a lot of attention on capacity building on national strategies. On South Korea alone, you have this sharp number of 5,000 new AI specialists by 2022. And it's important to mention that a lot of national strategies end up focusing on notions on AI, even in early education. You can see that on the strategy of Germany and Mexico, for instance. There is a lot of effort to go beyond STEAM. Of course, STEAM end up getting all the focus, but some national strategies end up focusing on the necessity of an interdisciplinary background to tackle AI challenges. And you can see that pretty much in the Italian and in the Indian documents, that you need to have an interdisciplinary approach. And of course, it's important to mention that we have this question of, is it AI arms race or is it a form of cooperation? And you can see a lot of language concerning cooperation among states in several national strategies. For example, Mexico and India are two strategies that aim to lead a global South cooperation towards AI. This slide is just to show how the language on research is carved out in the Chinese strategy. And one thing that I find really striking on the Chinese national strategy on AI is its timeline on 2020 on the investment, a very heavyweight investment on AI research. By 2025, the achievement of major breakthroughs on AI applications. and having by 2030, China, as they say in the national strategy, achieving world-leading levels, making China the world's primary AI innovation center. So it is a very a strong message that China ended up sending out on the national strategy, setting the country to, by the end of this decade that we are entering to right now, being the world leader on AI. Going into, and I'll go very quickly here on industry, it's interesting to see, we can talk about the numbers, but one thing that I'm really interested on is to see how some countries might want to replicate on AI, something that might be on their industry's DNA, in offering services that they already end up rendering in other stages, in other sectors, and end up doing this for AI as well. So it's interesting to see in the India national strategy, you see this concept of India becoming an AI garage, offering solutions to the region and to the world, but serving as an entry point for some other countries to use the services, the AI services that will be handled in India, and having India with this concept of being a garage of some sort for artificial intelligence. Focusing on industry, you have a focus on startups, of course, and thinking on small and medium-sized companies, and you can see that pretty much in some national strategies. Mexico, it's a good example. And the whole idea of AI as a service and open data for competition, you see in some strategies. I think Japan is an important one. But having just a side note, thinking about countries in the global south, it's important to understand how this quickly paced AI industrialization effort that's being setting out in some countries, how it will impact by the end of the day countries in the global south. I always like to go through the image that we have here in Brazil. When Brazil used to be a colony of Portugal by 1810, we had this very interesting situation in which the Portugal king, fleeing from the Napoleon Wars, ended up setting the court in Brazil, which was very unique to have an European king setting the court in Brazil, especially in Rio de Janeiro. And at the time, Portugal was England's best friends in terms of commerce. And one of the first acts that the king in Brazil ended up doing is open up the ports for English ships to go down to Brazil to sell goods. And it was quite remarkable to see that some of the goods that the British men ended up selling in Brazil were ski boots. And there is no snow in Brazil whatsoever. So there was no usage for ski boots because people end up not skiing in Brazil. We have nowhere to ski here. And there's almost like this anecdote of you selling to a population something that has practically no use to them. It's something that we definitely want to avoid on AI, with the idea that we might creating software solutions, applications elsewhere that might be trained with a data set that might be useless to some other country. And this is something that we might pay extreme attention moving forward. This is just a slide on robotization in Japan. I love the fact that Japan ended up using in the national strategies for robotics. That's not the strategy for AI, that's the one for robotics, because Japan has two different strategies. And they talk about a robot barrier-free society, but we can come back to that in the Q&A. And this is just a slide to show the different phases on the AI industrialization map of Japan. And just to conclude on the principles, national strategies end up addressing a lot of principles, focusing mostly on ethics, fairness, diversity, and we have some contributions that are really interesting, as the document from the EU Commission, encouraging diversity of gender, racial, ethnic origin, religion, belief, and so on, but being considered this type of concerns on diversity on all stages of AI development, and it's great to have that in the document. But focusing on national strategies, I think it's interesting to mention that France, India, and Italy end up having a language on transparency and opening up the black box. It's interesting that India and France end up referring to the word black box concerning AI. So it's interesting to see that even in national strategies, you end up having this type of concern. Just to conclude, I think 2 years ago, Macron ended up giving this interview to the Wired magazine. And I think it's really interesting to see how he ended up envisioning not only the national strategies for France, but a European vision on AI as well. If you take a look on one of the remarks, Macron would say that the US, it's entirely driven by the private sector with large corporations dealing with the AI revolution. And they will end up preferring, having preference for private choices over collective values. And that's Macron saying. And you have on Chinese, he will say, on China, he will say, Chinese players collect a lot of data driven by governments whose principles and values are not ours. So this idea of having European values for AI, it's something that we want to take a look on, especially when we address this issue of a global conversation among principles that can be, of course, very diverse. So I will just conclude saying that our friends from the Berkman Klein Center in a study coordinated by Jessica Fields have this very interesting visualization of different principles that you have been set out in different documents, not only governmental national strategies, I might say. This principle AI study end up focusing on private sector, civil society documents as well. This is just a glimpse of the clusters of principles that this study end up presenting. And this is just to say that I don't bring here a lot of conclusions, but what I would wanted to contribute to this debate, since this third Istanbul Privacy Symposium challenges with this question of what the future holds. I thought that maybe going through the lenses of AI national strategies could be a good way for us to understand the different forces that are being set in motion through the AI revolution. And since it's a workshop it's a symposium on privacy and data protection, I think it's important to mention that we hear this mantra so much on data being the new oil. It's interesting to see on countries in the Middle East, on their national strategies, that this mantra is pretty much true. The idea that going after the economy of oil, they wanted to have digitalization and AI as the next wave that will bring development to those countries. So it's interesting to see the different approaches, even if national strategies do share a common language. Of course, we have pretty much different views here. And I think it's a worthwhile effort to map these different views and understand how they might lead us to a global conversation. So thank you. Sorry for going a little bit over my time, but I give it back to you, Leila, and BİLGİ. Thanks again for this very kind invitation.
Thank you so much, Carlos. You really showed a great map, and you pointed out our similarities and our differences in terms of national AI strategies. Thank you so much for your great contribution in that regard. Now we can jump to Q&A session. We have a lot of questions. Thank you so much for this interactive participation of our attendees. And I requested of our speakers, we have a lot of questions. In order to use our time efficiently, please go through Q&A button and see the related questions. And I I kindly ask you to choose one or two questions which you would like to answer. And Andrea, I guess you answered a few questions in the meantime.
I cannot type as fast, but I'm trying to answer all of them. So I think I'll leave one or two to maybe one for a discussion. But if you let me, I'm finishing. If somebody else starts, I'll be done with one more when it's my turn.
Need to answer, because I can merge some of them together.
Well, actually, I would like to pass my time, well, specifically to Michael and Andrea, because I know the persons addressing the questions. We can answer them privately, and I'm really, they're much more interesting questions, especially to Berkut. So I would just like to give the little remaining time to them, if I may.
Yeah, thank you, Emre. So let's start with Michael.
Right, so there's three questions for me, and I can think I can merge them together. Ezgi and also Sue asked about effectively the best way to regulate in light of the worries about encryption, and also Susan asked around the legitimacy of cookie regulations. They're all related. So the first thing to do, I think, is we have to think that the power in encrypted systems comes from the ability to have a monopoly to run code on an individual device and to force a device to run code against what it wants. And AI, so the problem I actually had with all of the AI documents that we went through in the last talk with Carlos, which was really, really useful, with they all miss out infrastructure. Pretty much every single one of them misses out the role of platforms and infrastructure. And so we have to tackle that head on and say the problem we have at the moment is that AI is not about data. AI is about who controls the infrastructure and how they purpose it in a live and ongoing way. So we have to tackle that as a source of the power. And that's where, for example, the privacy regulation has to meet Digital Services Act, intermediary liability, interoperability law to crack open those infrastructures. The interesting, so I don't think that works in a self-regulatory way, like one of the questions. I think, unfortunately, we have to be creative. We have to have a normative vision of how we want the internet to function. And we have to work politically to get there, because it's gone too far now to try and put plasters on. Lastly, the question from Susan around cookie regulations and their legitimacy. The interesting thing in Europe is a cookie regulation is really about, can an organization access or store data on your device? So that's much closer to something that we would come to when we're regulating protocols, because it's not about the quality of the information. It's not about where the information is going. It's about how an organization interacts with your device. So people tend to lambast the cookie regulations, but I think that's the wrong way to go about it. They may be a bit too consent focused, but I think the cookie regulation and e-privacy directive is what we're talking about here in Europe, has something going for it. It focuses on legitimate things that you can do with other people's devices. And that's where we're going to have to put our emphasis in the future. And we actually should probably be learning more from the e-privacy directive than people think when they want to cut it down or to change its approach.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks, Michael. Sorry. I think Leila, we can also have a question. Sorry.
Maybe we can ask Carlos. There's just one question to him.
Okay. Leila, as you wish. Since we are with some time constraints, I'll be happy to go through the chat and answer them as well.
Okay.
I can answer my last question. I think I answered all of the others. So as a general statement, please do reach out to me. You should have my email. If you don't have it, it's just my name my surname @santannapisa.it. And I'm very happy to discuss things with you or send you articles or papers or things that I deem relevant. on those matters. So I only have one question left, that is regarding I would say still the electronic personhood, basically the possibility of registering applications. And I agree completely. So when I said that I'm not a big fan of the electronic personhood, I don't think what I meant is actually that I don't think that that is the best solution under all circumstances. I'm very much against a one-fits-all solution to any issues revolving around advanced technologies, even with respect to liability. I do believe that there might be some cases where electronic personhood might have a reason and a purpose, but not all cases. So I don't think that you need to attribute electronic personhood to my smart toothbrush, but not even to a driverless car. Driverless cars can be easily tackled through a legal reform of the structure of liability that greatly simplifies the existing legal system, and you can address that through insurance. If you're thinking of applications, AI-based application used in financial markets, you might want to register those. You might want to force people to disclose their interests in the system. You might want to impose obligations directly upon the system. And so for transparency reasons, much more than liability reasons, you might want to have a legal personhood and electronic personhood. So there might be good cases, good examples. I'm not saying that you never need that notion. There might be cases, but they have to be argued on a case-by-case basis, like any other considerations with respect to advanced technologies. So it's not a matter of a one-fits-all solution. AI means basically nothing. You know, artificial intelligence means everything and nothing altogether. It's a moving target. The notion changes over time. What is deemed AI today won't be deemed AI tomorrow. So we need to have, we need to regulate driverless cars. We need to regulate drones. We need to regulate expert system. And expert system, I think, should be regulated in a way when they are used in the legal field, and in another way when they're used in the medical profession, because those fields have differences. They have different societal impacts. There are many more things that build around the technological aspects that have a bearing, and that needs to be taken into account. So this is my tentative answer.
Thank you, Andrea. And Berkut, you have a few questions, but if you like to answer, yeah, please.
I got one, I think. Just to read it out, do you think the common legal language to be achieved by AI would help excluded languages? My answer on that, maybe it's I, and maybe it's no. So the first part of my answer was in Gaelic. The second part of my answer was in Old Scots. I love minority languages. I think they're really important for cultural diversity in Europe. They need protection. And I think we are at a threshold. They have AI, and generally digitization has a massive potential to revive them, to support them, but it can also marginalize them and push them even further towards extinction, simply because there are easier approaches for languages with lots of speakers. There's an excellent book by Mary Jones, Endangered Languages and New Technologies. And I think she and her contributors show some of the roadmaps. I think what it would need, well, firstly, if AIs are used by the state for legal service delivery, that should not be obligatory. States should not be able to wiggle out of their obligations towards the legally recognized minority languages. They should not wiggle out of the obligation under the European Charter on regional and minority languages. So there it is non-negotiable, I would say. For the private sector, I would hope for the same. I don't think it will happen if we leave it to the private sector, simply because there's less money to be made here. So I do think we need investment in infrastructure there. We need targeted investment into research and technology. And we potentially need also adjustment of things like intellectual property law, a greater ability to data mine the existing sources without fear to fall foul of the database directive. So we need a concerted effort of financial efforts, legal efforts, and infrastructural efforts. But I think it's worth doing. Not allowing people to interact with the state in their language is denying their identity. And I think for the recognized minorities in Europe, like the Welsh, Gaelic, Sorbian communities in Europe, that is absolutely essential. So it can go either way, but I think we can push it in a direction that AI helps to keep these languages and cultures alive.
Thanks much, Berkut, for your answer. And we have heard from amazing speakers and discussed what the future holds when it comes to AI, how to seize opportunities and avoid pitfalls. There are still many uncertainties and questions to be answered. And as the time goes on, we may have more questions than we started with, but these questions make our field even more exciting. Within that in mind, I am delighted to introduce our esteemed keynote speaker to give the closing keynote speech of the third Istanbul Privacy Symposium. The keynote speech is about the EU regulatory state and an ecosystem of trust. Our keynote speaker has many years of experience behind him and has been a big name in the fields of criminal law, privacy, and data protection. An active and busy academic, he's a professor of law at the Faculty of Law and Criminology of Vrije University, Brussels. He's the director of the research group on fundamental rights and constitutionalism and senior member of the research group of law, science, technology, and society. He also is an associated professor of law and technology at the Tilburg Institute for Law and Technology. Coming from the heart of the EU and considering how his work has contributed to creating the legal academic discipline of data protection law, he is one of the most relevant names to discuss the regulatory framework for AI in Europe and the ecosystem of trust. His recent piece published on the EU Law blog criticizes the European Parliament's approach regarding the personality to AI. With that, I ask that you give your full attention to Professor Dr. Paul de Hurt and welcome him to give his closing keynote speech of our symposium.
Thank you. I'm very much honored, and I'm always ashamed of having a status aparte in the light of so many speakers that I respect and I like. So I'm not responsible for that, but I am gonna assume my choice to participate. I've always wanted to be in Istanbul myself, so this is dreadful. I'm there, but I'm not there, and I hope to amend this in the future. Now, I had a long Jesuit speech to escape harsh debates and to evolve towards closure. I'm very good in very abstract things that are quite innocent. But last week, my colleague and me, Vangelis, we published a blog on the European Law Forum and on the legal personality discussion that has been present in the discussion before me. And that has raised a lot of emotions. And it's sadly for me to announce that I'm going to discuss that part too. But in emotions, there is no way of winning with a rational argument. This is something where all lawyers have strong opinions and feelings about. It's about capitalism. It's the same with capitalism or neoliberalism, property of data. I have never seen a conversion of mind. People, on the contrary, every debate seems to invite to take a more principled stand and leads towards the opposite. With that said, I'm gonna present my original speech in an abbreviated form, saying some Jesuitic things about terminology and the regulatory approach, and then I'm gonna discuss the blog and why I disagree with Andrea, for instance, but I'm actually not disagreeing because at the end he said things that, in my opinion, bring us, narrow the gap between us. I'm gonna try to share my screen. I have not done that often in my life. You should, I should open system preferences. I don't know how that works. Yes. I have to close the app. Are you still with me? Yes.
I think you should just use the share. First, open the file that you will share, and then click share the screen button.
Yeah, but I had to reset my my everything here. I'm gonna do that immediately. I'm getting quite handy, and so if you bear with me,
maybe we can help you, Paul. We have your presentation.
Exactly.
Yeah,
I could share if it's yeah, of course. If you prefer that.
Yeah, that would be fun. And then I can...
Sure.
So this is the first slide. Is that it? Do you see it? No? within a second.
Just 1 second. Like, yeah.
Oh, yeah, I just, I'm not good in this. By the way, I will send my last slide now to your colleague because I have added something, but please start the PowerPoint and then, no, let's start this one, the old one, okay? I don't see a PowerPoint, so it's coming. Yeah, so there it is. So I added my co-author, Vangelis Papakonstantino. In my opinion, this can become bigger. What do I want to say? I want to, first of all, defend Brussels. I'm Brussels-based, and it has been a joy in my life, and I'm going to explain why that remains the case, I think. And then I'm going to delve into a concept of ecosystem of trust put forward by the Commission. Then I'm going to discuss, come back to that creativity and why lawyers should start reading 2020 policy documents suddenly. And then I'm going to come to that awarding legal personality debate that is so interesting. The blog is there. So for those that multitask, please go to the blog if you want and start reading while listening to my Jesuitic things. Next slide, please. Or can I do this myself? No. So first, there's a lot happening. After the GDPR was there, there has been a lot of activity in Brussels. We have been standing in a freeze position till the GDPR got published. And then I have tried to map all the developments since then. Many things started moving at a high speed and many intelligent things. So I want to defend policymaking. And why is Brussels so interesting? Is it because they can hire good experts? Is it because there's no localism, but there's a more global view? Or is it because of their a multiplicity of legislators? There's a regulatory competition between the Commission, the Council, and so forth. Or is it, and that is something I would like to stress, because I do think political people have a genius sometimes, and academics just could figure as a rapporteur of that. But a lot of creative things are done in the action of policymaking, and I would like to insist and defend some that position of those political leaders that are sometimes innovating and at least inspiring me. Next slide, please. So there is this race to regulation has been discussed, but it's fun to see that even Google wants it. So there's a theme there on the regulatory activities of these private companies and the way they steer these global agendas. That is already an academic interesting feature. Next slide, please. These are the dates that you all know. So 2017 up till now, and it's going roller coaster, and even 2020 has been particularly important. And I leave out all the directives that have been voted and prepared last year in 2019. This is a tsunami of things. Next slide, please. The two documents I want to single out are the Commission's white paper on AI. That was so the 2019 document where these heavy loaded terms of ecosystems are used, but there are two ecosystems in that document, the ecosystem of trust and the one of excellence. So there's always been, it has been remarked, this concern for innovation and then the concern for value, protecting European values and aligning innovation with these values. And that is also very visible in this document. Now, what the Commission wants is a risk approach that is very popular. It will save a lot of criticisms from all over the world concerning over-regulation, but exceptionally, the Commission says, a more horizontal approach is possible, exceptionally when AI applications could be of high risk, could be seen as more than just a sectorial problem, could be seen as a horizontal problem, irrespective of the sector. And the Commission points out two of these possibilities: recruitment at the workplace and facial recognition. So I'm coming back to that. Next slide, please. And these are, well, there's one missing. There are 3 resolutions of the Parliament then, recent, in my latest slide, and they're on the blog. I start my blog with them. And they kind of rephrase the regulatory program that the EU should envisage. There is a heavy insistence on respecting values, on proportionality, on necessity. There is an interesting new terminology with users and developers and so on that I like. That is all very interesting. But all three European Parliament resolutions insist on there needs to be regulatory activity, but no legal personality. And I found that amusing. And that's why we have written the blog, because if you go back in this history of the policy making, there was actually one of the ideas that the Parliament itself proposed to the Commission. Could you check on this legal personality, dear Commission? And the Commission started saying, shouting, no, no, no. And that is interesting. So a seemingly innocent topic has now become a big taboo or no-go in this regulatory approach. Now, on my new PowerPoint that I should send and distribute, I go into these definitions. What is trust? We should actually ask ourselves that question all days. It is about, it's about self-confidence. Self-confidence that you can co-create the future and that actions make sense. That is future, that is trust, and democracy draws on that one, and we need trust, so it's important. Now, trust today has received a new notion, and that is academically also interesting. It used to be trust vis-a-vis the government. Can we trust the government? But today's concept of trust has changed, has broadened, because there is this important issue of trusting private actors that is on the table all the time. So there is development with understanding this notion of trust. Now, what is regulation? We all know what that is, but interesting for me is Roger Brown's word book on it, singling out the EU as a particularly disruptive regulator. So for all those that believe that we shouldn't have a tabula rasa thing and that we should move carefully, amend the law where possible, and many of my colleagues are actually on that lane. So it's a kind of organic development thing. That is not what the EU does. If the EU sits down, Brown's word notes, it starts from scratch like an architect. It starts with an empty page. It does not do organic things. And one of the things that the EU is bad is developing a framework, for instance, that is respectful of the GDPR. Because how to do that? They have voted the GDPR then. Now there are other DGs preparing a lot of other laws. And then how to do this? Are you just gonna say, hey, the GDPR has to be respected too? Or are you gonna do the GDPR exercise in the new laws? The EU doesn't really like that kind of synchronization exercises, and it's rather brutalist. So that is a good thing for a person like me, who would like to see that legal personality recognized as a kind of brutalist intervention. Now, but before coming to that one, I want to express some irritation about this risk approach and this prudence of the Commission. If we could go 2 slides back, please, in recognizing, yeah, this one, no, yeah, in recognizing, in identifying AI systems that are riskful for society at large. And so we're all thrown again in balancing sectorial things. We are thrown again in the GDPR exercise of not judging applications and technologies ex ante, but be careful, give them an opportunity. As long as they play the rules of the game, we could consider that, and we could take the sharp angles off of that. So let's go 3 slides further. Yeah, I am deeply, deeply saddened by that. And this is a sadness that also includes a general feeling of awkwardness with data protection law. Data protection is good in regulating things, but it's not good at all in saying no to things we don't want. And I have been studying that process for years, and I ended up with Mary Douglas, a famous anthropologist, and Bauman, a sociologist that showed me the way. And we should really reflect this principled approach that is embedded in data protection law and that is not now seen as a model for AI. I would strongly urge for complementing that approach that is always balancing things is avoiding the sharp rejections of new technological applications with a more classical one. And the arguments go deep. They go deep into anthropological understandings of human beings and of certain groups in our society. And Douglas talked about this in the 1970s, and she distinguished between restricted codes that are often at work in working class spheres and elaborated codes that the middle class seems to apply. So what is a restricted clause? What is an example of a restricted code? Mommy, why should I do this? You should do this because, point. That is a messaging that is very powerful, it's authoritative, but it doesn't explain. And that is a typical way of transmitting norms in certain areas of society, I think in all areas of society, but the middle class has complemented that with another approach. It's about principling, it's about reasoning with the young child, and so on, and so on, and so on. Now, that has not convinced our anthropologists and our sociologists, and they have always pleaded for combining the two alternative instruments to gain effective grip on things. Yeah. And so that was the secret of the trust we had in the welfare states. We did both. We combined both, and we used, for instance, criminal law to give the final no's without justification. These things are holy, but we always also did that in other areas of law. For instance, with regard to illegal practices in trade, those were labeled and identified in annexes and so on. So we have this ability of saying no and drawing red lines, and for the things that are more or less okay, to streamline them, to apply principles and rules of the game. And that powerful regulatory approach of the welfare state is one that I keep on recommending, even if we should realize, and that is Bauman's point, that we are going beyond that welfare state. So we are now in a liquid society where nothing is solid anymore. But I still would recommend reflecting about the tools we have applied for 30 years in the 20th century to create some solidity in lawmaking and in gaining people's trust. So there's an interesting literature, at least for me. Next slide, please. So, and just to know, still linked to the other slide, I'm doing a study on facial recognition laws in the US compared to the EU. We Europeans tend to look down at the US. It has a piecemeal approach. It has an incomplete approach. But if you compare these things, that dichotomy between the general approach of the Europeans and the piecemeal approach of the Americans doesn't hold. I think that we can learn a lot from the US approach to facial recognition, things like bans, moratoriums. We do not want facial recognition of 2 years. I haven't heard that in data protection circles of Europe, and I don't see how they would achieve such a result. So there's a lot to learn. And in these laws on facial recognition in the EU, there is an understanding that these two languages that I just mentioned should be combined. So that is, and I see that as a weak spot in the EU regulatory approach. We don't draw the limits. We expect that everything will just be balanced out in a good way. And I don't think that will happen, and that trust will be gained. So I leave out the ecosystem analysis. My second point, I could go, I love that term ecosystem. It's like a religion, by the way. But the point I want to make is that if you look at what the EU is doing, what Brussels is producing, not only in the expert reports, but also in all these directives voted last year, there's a lot to learn from a data protection perspective. And I could illustrate this with dynamic information techniques that are developed in consumer law and similar novel ideas that are not present in the GDPR, but are present in these many laws that the EU has voted in other areas. And only last, so next slide, no, keep this one, please. Oh, keep this one. Only last week, Parliament voted the collective redress directive. And what I see is compared to the GDPR, there's a huge progress in terms of enabling and imposing this collective model of protecting citizen interest, and it's explicitly incorporating the violations of the GDPR. So, and that brings me to my next slide. There's a mechanism at work. It's a terrible term. It's a Dutch thing that has been translated on that Wikipedia site. It's the law or mechanism of the handicap of those that were first. And this is what I see happening today. Data protection was first, many novel ideas till 2016, but now it's lagging behind. We should do the exercise again and learn from all these other fields, because the best ideas now are out there. And so the law of this head start, you were first then, but now you're lagging behind, is, although it's Dutch, and I do not want to boast that idea too much, but I see the mechanism at work here. Next slide, please. So now let's turn to this AI discussion. I think the discussion has been troubled by high abstract level discussions about granting them human rights or not. And so the interest for me and my colleague, Papa Constantino, to enter this discussion was, let's go not high abstraction level, not even mid abstraction level, let's go very concrete. And let's keep it very legal. I think, and because we believe, and I'm not the only one, if Andrea Bertolini, that is the level of the debate where we would like to see it beyond the high abstraction discussions about human rights for robots, yes or no. We think there's an interesting legal debate to be held there. Next slide, please. So what we think, and I think, and that's where I take some pride, or I would like to see the debate to be held, is that if you approach the debate with starting points such as proximity, flexibility, and efficiency, then there is a case for awarding legal personality to AI. And that is all explained in the blog. So it's a very concrete level. If I take the example of the intelligent car, as was explained by Andrea Bertolini, who added that we need to expect litigation between at least 10 parties involved in producing that car, then I think from the perspective of legal certainty of all those partners, and from the perspective of the citizen driving that car, we're not going in the right direction. And there are two scenarios to deal with this plurality of actors involved in it. There's the approach now in the GDPR. Everybody's a joint controller, and I don't like that, and I will explain. And there's another one. This is a one-on-one basis thing, and for me, that would be the AI program that is running these cars, for instance. So the same with Siri in my Apple computer. If it causes damage in the future, I wouldn't know where to start. Apple is gonna push away all liability and so on. So I think in terms of proximity, there might be some advantage in working with some kinds of legal personality recognition things, mechanisms there. So that flexibility is the other one. Recognizing legal personality, for us, it should be done very piecemeal. In every legal field, the exercise should be done. And do we need it in taxation law? Do we need it in property law, civil law? Do we need it in criminal law? All these things, liability law, all these things are open. And the appeal there is that we should there go in a sector diagnosis. Could it have added value? So we think, and there's nothing per se that makes the notion of legal personality unflexible. It's us who are creating it, and we can determine its extent. There is also no principled Kantian logic there that if you recognize one bit, you have to recognize everything. On the contrary, it's a fiction created by humans as the legal person as we have known. And so we call our proposal the digital person, which would be a new fiction, but of course it should be fine-tuned as we have done with the legal person. And just to recall, some countries hold them criminal liability, these legal persons, others don't, but the fiction has no problem with that because It's a fiction created by us, and I would suggest the same here. Now, efficiency, that is a last argument. We think indeed AI is a bit everything. It is a method. It will appear in a lot of applications. It is not a product, and I think it raises a lot of confusion, and we think that some of that confusion at certain points could be taken away by recognizing some legal personality there. Now, I have tested, I had so many reactions of my colleagues, and yes, there were the battery of old arguments, suspicious of neoliberal agendas behind it, and legal personality doesn't work. As a criminal lawyer of training, I disagree with it. I see, for instance, that prosecutors love it, and they hold liable both the natural persons in the company that has committed a crime and the company. So they combine liabilities and so forth. It is a fine instrument that can be modulated by us. And if there are perceived weaknesses in the use of the legal person, then we should, of course, take into account those deficiencies when devising a digital personality. So next slide, please. So these are some of the frequently asked and frequently uttered remarks about this story about legal personality. Again, there is no hidden agenda from my side. I'm not paid by anybody. It is a legal agenda. I like proximity, I like flexibility, and I would like to see the discussion there rather than on a more abstract level, which is not a level where I'm very good in. And so what I wanted to suggest is that, and in the blog we're doing it, that the parliament does not have it right. It suggests clearly that AI is a challenge for the regulatory agenda, that it is, and that something new is required. But if you look if you look closely at it, one sees that what is done is not just straightforward application of existing rules, but amending existing rules using the GDPR as an example. And in our blog, we express a certain criticism there, but we would like to draw the attention on the major idea is we don't have to create this in a brutalist way, but data protection is now experimenting with, like environmental law, with regulatory sandboxes. And we would like to do that too. Let's experiment with legal personality in a sandbox, which is a recognized area where these legal concepts can be tested out. And then we can draw lessons from it. And I hope that the lessons will be assessed in the light of proximity, efficiency, and so on. I have never liked a discussion on human rights. I'm a litigator by sympathy. If I see the court on human rights, there are many companies can go to Strasbourg when certain rights are violated. And for me, this idea of power checking is so important. And I don't really care who is checking on that power, being the individual harmed, a collective entity, a legal person, or whatever. It's about power out there that should be checked. And if this can help, I'm in favor of it. Last slide, please. So that was it. Thank you for having endured with me. And again, all my apologies of being the last speaker. That was totally unjustified.
Thank you, Paul, for this great presentation. You had a very busy day, we know. And despite that, you joined us. Thank you so much for that. And I would like to ask panelists, I am sure Andrea and Emre, who worked on legal personality to AI, would like to say something. And I know BİLGİ has one question to you, Paul. So let's start with Andrea, then Emre, and I will take it back to BİLGİ.
So I didn't know I would have these answers, this opportunity, and I was actually writing Paul an email, and I will send it anyway because I wrote it in the meantime. I did read your blog and I agree with you on most points. I agree with you on the need of a piecemeal approach, is what I call a bottom-up approach. And I do agree that we need to have a legal discussion that is not a philosophical one. So I really am against this philosophical claim that machines are ontologically different. And I don't think that there is where the debate should happen. And quite frankly, I'm very surprised by positions such as that of Floridi, that on the one hand argues on a philosophical ground that machines are could be deemed moral agents, and at the same time is against the notion of legal personhood. I think that he's wrong twice, because there is no philosophical reason to consider the machine an agent, and there could be legal grounds to hold them liable. I don't agree with you on the example of driverless cars, because there are things that you can be much more to the point by holding one single party liable. And it's a similar result, because you're using the legal personality to create a single fictive entity towards which all litigation can be directed. I think in some cases you need an intermediate subject, such an electronic person. In other cases, you might do that by just singling out one responsible party. And I think that at European level, we have a very good example in the Consumer Sales Directive. I think the Consumer Sales Directive has a very good example of a one-stop shop approach that works. Because if you're a consumer and your product doesn't work, you simply go to the shop where you bought it and you give it in. It's not that shop that is responsible for the product not working as it should, and yet they are obliged by the law to repair it, to replace it, or give you your money back. And this is a one-stop shop, a single entry point for all litigation that is very effective. I think that is a very good example of legislation that works. And I'm pretty much against the proposal of the European Parliament, because I think that the biggest mistake they're trying to make is that they're trying to regulate AI as a single entity. And I don't think that AI is everywhere. And in most cases, it's irrelevant that it is there. In some cases, it is relevant. But for instance, in the current proposal of the European Parliament, they say that if an AI-based system such as Watson was to be deemed a high-risk application, and I really don't like this distinction between high risk and low risk. If it were a high-risk application, then a medical doctor using Watson would be held to a strict standard of liability. Now, I ask you, which doctor will ever want to use Watson-like applications in his medical practice? No one will ever want to do that, because he will be held to a much stricter standard of liability than what he would be held at if and member states' laws on medical liability would apply, that in most cases are simply tort law, so negligence-based rules. So that would be a huge barrier to the penetration into the market of that kind of solutions that are instead desirable and beneficial to a large extent. So I really believe that the European Union should make the effort of being more specific, of not attempting to regulate AI unitarily. In some cases, maybe yes, for some aspect, yes, definitely not for liability. I think that the risk is really that of throwing a nuclear bomb on the development of AI. So this is more of a comment than a question.
This is the discussion, I like it. And I wanna, if the outcome is no legal digital personality, but these alternatives to achieve flexibility and proximity and so on, yes, I am totally on your side. I've not married into the concept, but this is the intervention I'm afraid of. Go ahead, Berkut.
Well, yeah, someone must make an ontological, philosophical objection, so it can be as well me. My big problem with proposing legal personhood for AIs is that the minimum that I require to regulate anything is an identity criterion for what is regulated. For humans, we have that, even though we know philosophically it's all very dubious. Am I the same person in 10 years down the line? Philosophers like Singer and Parfit say no, but we have a clear notion that I am the same in a certain relevant way. With companies, we just about manage, but even there it already gets difficult because they can fold and then re-emerge with exactly the same people doing exactly the same thing, and that technically speaking, a new company, and that already creates problems. What I haven't seen is anything that is workable from a legal perspective that gives me clear enough criteria to say, this is now a different AI. At which point does an upgrade change it from the one that it was to simply a new object? how many Alexas do we have? One on every mobile phone, one on the single server? If I connect Alexa from my office with my home and regulate there's a thermostat, is that now one robotic system or are they two? So for me, the problem really is we do not have sufficiently clear, and that is a very philosophical objection, I know, but I don't think we have sufficiently clear identity criteria for AIs to make them a focal point of regulation. That's my big problem with that notion.
Leila, are you the chair?
Yes, please.
So, can I?
But Paul, please go ahead.
I love the, no, it's not, you're doing an enormous effort to be nice to me, Berkut, because you're bringing it back to identity criteria. And on a philosophical level, you understand that even human identity, that the Buddha and Hinduism has already taught us this centuries ago, is something that is a mirage that we, so, but one of the things around is like in non-discrimination law is a lot of Roman people or gypsies don't want to be called gypsies. And one of the techniques to deal with that is self-declaration. Yeah? So in a voluntary scheme of, such a voluntary scheme would be in my sandbox. So there's a company coming with a software program that is Siri of Apple. And it comes to the registry and it says legal personality for this, and I would apply all the local requirements for this, and is there enough money to safeguard liability claims afterwards, and so on. But then in that self-declaratory moment, one of the requirements could be that the software that has been registered continues to identify itself as the registered software and so on. So let's play along. But if my if my Siri computer continues to irritate me the way it does all the time, because it always thinks I call for help and I never call for help, I would kill the damn thing. You know, so if that causes serious liabilities later on, I would like to see some liability there. And yes, it would, if there are parts of it everywhere, then the whole should suffer from human intervention via a judge, via a court that allocates responsibilities and so on. Yes.
That's a really interesting answer. We really should discuss at one point Buddhism, AIs, and the self. But yes, I like that. It definitely will make me rethink some of my points. Yep. Thanks.
Emre, would you like to say something about this discussion?
Well, okay. Actually, this issue was discussed in Istanbul BİLGİ University in another campus, Dolapdere, in about 14 years ago. But it was just discussed by myself. I discussed with myself. But anyway, then I came to Tilburg. Paul helped me. He was my first supervisor, enlightening, guiding. I'm always grateful. I have to say this. Coming to AI issue, okay, one thing I agree with Andrea that it's difficult to pinpoint and it becomes an integral part of every artifact. So where is the AI? And I remember the famous anecdote of Savigny that he had never had breakfast with a legal person. So, okay, we know that we can have a breakfast with a legal person. At the end, it's a fiction. And then it comes down to this question: what are the good reasons to contain liability for an AI entity? And following from that, actually, I'm a black letter lawyer, commercial lawyer. So, okay, let's go to company law again, because what I did 14 years ago, and I will do the same again. So we have companies with legal personality and we have companies without legal personality. And we very well know these are all for good reasons. And at some point, they have some practical value. At some point, they don't. So I think in order to reach a better discussion on this, I think first it could be better to exhaust discussions there, legal personality company, personal company, or non-legal personality company, because those are very, very practical grounds. And they also somehow serve some bigger policy options. So if I were to work on this issue, I will just go and analyze and study everything about either giving personality to a company or not. And looking into 19th century, I did this while I was teaching company law at Koç. Looking at the 19th century debates, it is fascinating. I think we can just go back to roots to 19th century and really look at the discussions that how they discussed legal personality, because we all know that legal personality in many cases could mean that also limited liability. So that's my answer without hurting any side. So I am learning the tricks of Brussels, I guess, huh?
Right. Chairman, can I reply?
Please,
yeah.
Please
so, Emre, when I know this discussion is very old, yeah, and I said this morning, after this evening, I will probably be discouraged to say anything about it because it's so old, but it's also a new discussion, and I think none of my fellow lawyers showed some irritation about the dominance of ideology and philosophy on this terrain. And so we're claiming as lawyers a perspective. And we're claiming, just like political people see things that academics don't see, philosophers tend to see their things. And I think lawyers can have a particular input here. And our crucial experience with modulating legal persons is of relevance here. I have seen no philosopher ever defending the system. Lawyers have developed it with great success. Now, so let's, and every time this raises cynical remarks, I want to engage in a discussion, because the legal personality is all around. It's a fiction that we apply daily, and it's constantly modulated. I could found an NGO easily 10 years ago. Now with terrorism and financing, I have to do a lot more. So the requirements for achieving this stamp of legal personality are changing. And indeed, that was the flexibility argument. I could very well see legal personality hopping up in one domain, company law, and not in another domain for many reasons. And so the European Parliament wants to prohibit it in the domain of IP law and creativity to protect the humans. So that is a very principled stand. But I would like to go back to flexibility, proximity, and so on. Now, where I disagree with you is the breakfast thing, and where is the AI? I think I have breakfast with AI. I mean, my Siri thing in the laptop is always interrupting me because it thinks I'm calling upon it. But the thing is that it's the wrong question. The question is, where is the human? It's not where is the AI. Everybody agrees that it will be that it will be always more and more difficult to trace back harmful interventions by humans in this complex AI supported world. And so, and then the chase for human traces is still possible, and it could be done at a serious cost. But I think there's a moment where we should make the switch and not only start looking for the human interventions that have caused the damage, but recognize the role of AI, because isn't that what AI is going to do? It's going to do a lot independent and autonomously. So then I come back to my one-on-one thing. And I have a feeling that if you only look at it from a citizen's perspective, you have only half the story. I don't think joint liability, joint controllership, these two methods of making 10 actors involved in producing and using technologies or AI methods is the way forward. Because then afterwards, these 10 will have huge legal battles, and it might be unfair to be inflicted with liability, even if you had a very minor role in the whole thing. So the legal, we're talking about legal fictions like a digital person, but we also talk about other fictions, legal presumptions about who is liable. And so there is a principle, not only in criminal law, but also broader, that you need some kind of guilt before you can be held liable. This is a feeling that is defendable and supported by the legal certainty aspect. So my take on this one is, if you want not only the ecosystem of trust, which you will never achieve via joint liability, but if you also want the ecosystem of excellence, promoting people to apply and develop AI, then you need to think about the interest of those people. And going in a regulatory sandbox and declaring certain softwares and asking, how much do I have to put on the bank to make this, what are the requirements and so on, is a way of proactively creating certainty. So the question is, where is the human in this game? It is disappearing, and it will be more and more difficult to trace back liabilities to humans. And for that reason, I am seeing a difference with the 19th century.
Thank you, Paul. And BİLGİ, your one question.
And thank you, Leyla Hocam. My question will be a bit the way forward. Thanks, Paul, for presentation, and thanks for everyone for their patience and being with us. The issue is that the European Union and the Council of Europe has different approaches concerning regulation of AI. As also Paul mentioned, the EU talks more about ethical AI and responsible AI, while the Council of Europe prefers to focus human-centric and human rights respect AI. How do you see the regulatory developments? What will be the way forward in these discussions, Paul? Just as a concluding, while we conclude this symposium, just the different approaches and what is waiting us in the long term or medium term. Thank you.
I don't thank you because I just published an article on the role of the Council of Europe in regulating AI, in regulating big data compared to the EU. And since I had defended that paper at a conference of the Council of Europe, it was very nice. But there are two nice complementary approaches possible. And my stance has always been, and my suggestion to the Council of Europe, don't listen too much to the EU bureaucrats. We need to build in a filter, a Chinese wall, and allow different creative processes and then see where we land. Whereas this taking hostage of the Council of Europe by the EU to make sure the one truthful regulation is not put into danger, that is not the approach. So my suggestion has always been to the Council of Europe, fall back on your own merits. You're addressing states, continue to do so. The EU is not addressing states anymore. It does so with the directives, but via these regulations, it is addressing citizens and companies straightforwardly. And it actually makes full abstraction of the states. And I would like to see, and that's why I also like the expose on the national strategies. I would love to see the state taking back a bit of the regulatory agenda on its shoulder and let the Germans do what they know how to do best, that is German-inspired regulation, and let the Latins do it their way and let the other ones do it that way. But that is made impossible by this GDPR modeled top-down approach of the EU. And so my recommendation to the Council of Europe would be go on your own strength and keep on reflecting about what an ideal lawmaker should do. That is more inspiring than just saying this is what needs to be done in all member states like the GDPR does. And I have been questioning this powerful expert mechanism of the EU in my writings. It is controlled by national data protection authorities and the Court of Justice. And if you dare to impose something as a member state that is infringing in the GDPR logic, you straightforwardly are held are found guilty by Luxembourg. And so coming back to what I said before, I don't think the EU model is very powerful because it's a middle class balancing things with generalities, omitting the need for clarities and bright line rules. And so we need Strasbourg judgments to tell data protection communities, hey, this is disproportional. And that is something that all these data protection authorities are not capable to do. So with regard to facial recognition, the Americans, they take technologies and methods seriously by explicitly saying what they don't like and how they want private parties to use it or not use it, and governments to use it and not use it. And I don't see that capacity of norm building present in, it's only fine tuning, forgetting that the bigger questions are concerning the citizens. Yeah? And so I want to put AI in jail, and I want to prohibit profiling in criminal codes, because that's where these actions belong if they have racist or discriminatory intentions. And that's what the Americans are doing. There are in the criminal law codes in the US clear provisions on illegal profiling. I have never seen that in data protection text. These people only act with one instrument that should solve it all, and it's not good. So I'm very happy with the regulatory post-GDPR activity in the respective areas where better ideas and more powerful ideas are found. So it's the inherent weaknesses that I see in data protection law are also present in the EU approach more broadly. And I think the Council of Europe can do better.
Thank you.
Carlos, you have a question also?
Yes, and this is super quick because I understand we're almost out of time. Paul, thanks for this amazing presentation. A lot of food.
Did Carlos freeze or?
Some authors end up.
We couldn't hear you. Can you please repeat your question?
Oh. Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah, it's a filter on compliments, Carlos. So drop the compliment.
It is. It looks like. But super quickly, some authors end up saying that the
sort of connectivity problems, I guess you have, Carlos.
You are. Carlos, you have frozen.
Perhaps Carlos should shut off the camera and ask the question.
Carlos, we couldn't hear you. We cannot hear you.
Sorry, just bad connectivity on my side.
Just turn off your camera and just use microphone.
Yeah.
Will be better, I guess.
Let me see if that works.
Yeah.
So the question will be, some people end up having a somewhat comment on the personality theory, saying that some people end up using an opportunistic view on e-personality or granting personality to AI, because when it comes to copyright, you want to treat AI as an object, saying, I don't want to give any rights to AI, but when it comes to damages, sorry, quite the opposite. When it comes to damages, you want to say that the fault and the damages is on the car, is on the autonomous car, not on the devs, not on the person that end up being involved in the development. But when it comes to copyright, you say, oh no.
Yeah.
Carlos, we cannot hear you.
But I think the argument was clear. Huh? So is there a disconnect between saying one and the other, Carlos? Yeah? Where is Carlos?
Well,
I think it's very late, but
yeah, okay.
Carlos, if I talk to Carlos, even if he's not here, but I come back to my point. Yeah, it is a tool, legal personality, digital personality that should be assessed sectorially. And it could well be that it is useful in liability law and not useful in IP law. And that is the outcome of an assessment, as I said, that should not be opportunistic. Now, what the parliament has done is said, we don't want it in IP law because we want to protect human creativity. But that is a negative argument. And I think we're all learning to live with AI. I don't think it's a powerful argument, but I would accept a deliberation with the outcome, no AI, digital personality in IP for many reasons. But that is very open. This is, again, a sandbox case. We have tried, there have been 2 cases in Europe with regard to this recognition of AI as with regard to IP rights. And the argument was because they don't have an address, we can't give it. But the fundamental question was avoided by this formalistic question. Was this a creative thing? And shouldn't we recognize creative rights and interest and so on? So, but again, let's do this. I know it's very dangerous to say, let's put God away or aside for one moment. It's very dangerous. And it's a typical liberal technique. And I would feel very bad if that was what people remember about my intervention, because I like God. God is the good, and we should not forget the good. But humbly, I would ask the world out there, the regulatory world, not to look at lawyers as a bunch of atheists, but as a bunch of very experienced craftsmen with their own technique that have experimented with a lot of things without asking for without putting the life of God in question. They were disregarding that question and not necessarily attacking the presence of the good and the necessity of the good. So that would be, again, I would solve it, Carlos, with the flexibility starting point.
Thanks, Paul. God is pleased. And sorry for my bad connectivity.
No worries at all. Now I guess it's time to say goodbye. And we thank our keynote, Paul de Hurt, and our panelists, Carlos, Michael, Alexa, Berkut, Emre, and Andrea, for their great contribution to the 3rd Istanbul Privacy Symposium. Thanks a lot for the audience for their interactivity and smart questions. A very big applause for the IT Law Institute's team, particularly Ayça and Ezgi behind the scenes, and our technical team for making this symposium real. We hope to meet you next year in Istanbul again, but hopefully not online, physically. Be well and safe. And Bedi, maybe you can say also something.
Stay safe and see you next year in Istanbul.
Take care. Bye.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.